IB Nation, welcome back to another edition of the Irish Breakdown Podcast. It's Tuesday, August 20th, which means the countdown is now 11 days until Notre Dame kicks off the college football season. And only, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, 4 days until we get some real college football action. I am excited. Cannot wait. Lots going on. I want to introduce you all to someone new. This is Trevor Trowbridge. Trevor, lean up. Show him you got that rocking that IB, right? Trevor is a new staff writer at irishbreakdown.com. He is a new member of our team. And, guys, I got to tell you, when I interviewed Trevor, I still going to hire some more people, but it's just one was like, okay, for about 5 minutes, I was like, all right, we're going to have to hire this guy because he's a really sharp guy. Former quarterback, so I'm a little biased there. You know, I love former quarterbacks because I am a former quarterback, but really wicked smart football guy. I'm excited to have him on board. And Trevor, we were going to have this show last Thursday, you and I together, but then some things in life happened on my end. But I am excited to have you with us today, man. Looking forward to the show.
Yeah, no, thank you for having me on. It's cool to be on this side of the desk. Been listening for the last 4 years, so excited to get into it, man. Cannot echo enough how excited I am for football season. I guess my seasonal depression is now over now that we're like a couple days out from football, so ready to get into it.
Well, we've got some fun topics today, Trevor, and we're going to talk for part one of our show today. We're going to talk Notre Dame running back room because – and I don't remember what sparked it, but I was having a conversation or I was doing some research on the running back room, and I started thinking, like, you know what? Like, Notre Dame is really coming along at running back after a long period of time where running back was okay, but nothing special. And then start thinking about the future, like, dude, they're about to go on a really impressive run here at running back. And so we're going to talk about, is Notre Dame entering a golden age at running back? Are they already in it? Or is what came before setting the stage for what's to come? Or are they already in it and it's only going to get better moving forward? Or will it just stay the same, which is still really good moving forward? So we're going to talk about the past, present, and future of the Notre Dame running back room. And you know what it actually got me started on it, Trevor, is I was doing some research on Ricky Waters in relation to Jeremiah Love, and then looking at the 1990 running back room, and I realized Notre Dame had 2 running backs that went to the NFL and rushed for 10,000 career yards. And then I look on that same team, and I'm like, Dorsey Levens is like 8th on the team in rushing, and he couldn't get on the field. He's a Super Bowl champion, multiple 1,000-yard season. I'm like, how loaded do you have to be that Reggie Brooks had to move to defense and Dorsey Levens can't get on the field at running back? And then that kind of got me thinking about where things have gone and where things are. So we're going to have some fun with that. And then part 2, and this is a shout out to a member of our message board, Jimmy McGill, who posed a question the other day about, is Notre Dame better or worse at certain positions? And then that sparked a very good discussion on the message board. And not everybody saw things the same way. Some people disagree with my quarterback take and my running back take, my linebacker take. And it was actually a good discussion, and I think there is room for debate. So what Trevor and I are going to do in part 2 and part 3 of the show is we're going to go position by position and then just kind of look at both sides of the ball, you know, sort of holistically, and say, where is Notre Dame? Where do we think Notre Dame is better right now compared to where they were last year? And where was Notre Dame better compared to where they were at this time a year ago, expectation-wise? So we'll focus more on what the unit was, but then also to give some context of what we thought it was going to be, because what you expect to be good isn't always good, and what you expect to be a problem isn't always a problem. And so we'll dive into that, and then we'll do this. We'll go position by position holistically. We'll do offense. Part 3 of the show will be the defense, and then we'll briefly mention special teams because that guy has some strong opinions on the special teams as well. So got another guy that's got some strong opinions on special teams. So Trevor, it's going to be a fun show, man. And again, I'm glad to have you. This is going to be a much more fun show with some dialogue as opposed to just me talking about it. So I'm super, super fired up to be able to talk about it with someone today.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm excited to get into it. It's stuff that, I mean, Bryan, you know this, that I'll talk my fiance's ear off about, but now that we can have this back and forth, it'll be good.
See, I'm actually going to help your relationship. That's what I'm here for. She's going to be so happy that you have someone else to talk to about this all the time. So yes, I'm here to help, man. That's what we do. That's what
I appreciate that. Appreciate it.
So let's dive into topic 1 here, Trevor. And topic one is going to be about the Notre Dame running back room. And you and I are from a different generation. I'm in my 40s. I believe you're in your mid 20s.
Yep, 27.
Okay, so mid to late-ish 20s. Very different generation. I was a freshman in college when you were introduced to this world. Okay, so we grew up in different eras of Notre Dame football, and so you look back at it and you think about how you're going to view certain aspects of Notre Dame is going to depend on when you were born. And I grew up as a Notre Dame fan, really starting in 1988, but then quickly looking at the history of Notre Dame football. When I was born, Vegas Ferguson was the star running back. Then he was basically replaced a couple years later by Alan Pinkett. And then Alan Pinkett was replaced by they went through a period of time where Notre Dame's backfield was, again, very loaded. You had the 1988 team that had that was so loaded at running back that they had to move Ricky Waters to wide receiver to start with Rocket Ismail. You had Mark Green, obviously, was your leading rusher. At running back, you had obviously Tony. You had Tony Rice was your leading rusher. You had Tony Brooks, who was a very talented player, should have played in the NFL longer if he didn't have some issue. You had Anthony Johnson, who played in the NFL, Rodney Culver, who played in the NFL. And then you kind of go through the years, 89. Again, it's Mark Green. It's the same group of guys in 1989. Anthony Johnson, Ricky Waters becomes your leading rusher at running back. Tony Rice is, again, your overall leading rusher. You had Rocket Ismail getting carries. In 1990, Notre Dame was so loaded at running back that they had two guys that had 10,000 career rushing yards in the NFL, and neither of them led the team in rushing. Rodney Culver did, who played in the NFL before he passed away. You still had Tony Brooks. You had Jerome Bettis on that unit. And they were so loaded that Jerome Bettis only ran for 115 yards that year. Dorsey Levens couldn't get on the field. He transfers to Georgia Tech, wins a Super Bowl with the Packers, multiple 1,000-yard rushing seasons. And Reggie Brooks got moved to defensive back. Reggie Brooks obviously would eventually finish in the top 5 in Heisman voting as a running back. That's kind of how loaded Notre Dame was back then. Obviously, Jerome Bettis and Rodney Culver were a great run-two punch in 91. And then, of course, in 92, arguably the best 1-2 punch of my lifetime at running back in Reggie Brooks and Jerome Bettis. A year later, one of my favorite, just fan favorite running backs at Notre Dame, Lee Becton, has a 1,000-yard season for the Irish as they go in 1993 as they finished number 2 that season. And that was a golden era of not only running back, but also fullback. Jerome Bettis, Ray Zellers, Mark Edwards. And then you kind of had a bit of a down period with Tony Fisher, and then right back to Autry Denson, who becomes the school's all-time leading rusher. And then after Autry, Trevor, it kind of was a little up and down. You know, you had some moments in there with like the Julius Jones has a big final year. I mean, Ryan Grant had a 1,000-yard season, but he was just kind of an okay back. You know, Darius Walker was a really good player. And then after that, running back was it was not a strength for the team. You know, you had some nice combos in the early 2000s, but, nothing special. You know, Jonas Gray and Sear Wood were a nice combo, and Sear Wood and Theo Riddick were a nice combo. And then you kind of get into, 2015, things kind of start to change a little bit, right? And you have a breakout season from CJ Prosise. Then Josh Adams emerges as an impact player. 2017, he has a monster season. He's gone. The next year, he gets replaced by Dexter Williams. He has a big-time season, almost rushes for 1,000 yards despite missing the first 4 games of the season. He's gone. The next year was just okay, although Tony Jones was still a good running back, averaged 6 yards a carry, and ran for over 850 yards. And in 2020, you have the emergence of Kyron Williams. We get 2 years out of him. 2022, you have a great 1-2 punch with Logan Diggs and Audric Estime, who rushed for over 1,700 yards combined. And then, of course, last year, Audric has a monster season and breaks a bunch of Notre Dame records, or at least gets in the record book, in regard to, career rushing yards, touchdowns, and then single season production. And then you start looking at this year and you say, man, not a lot of teams can lose a running back that rushed for over 1,300 yards and 18 touchdowns. And you say, I think they could actually have a chance to be even better. And that kind of what got me thinking, like, Notre Dame is in the middle of an era where, boy, they're putting some pretty good running backs in the field for college, and there aren't a lot of teams that can kind of have their success, but they're still not elite. Kyron was good, he wasn't elite. Dexter was good, he wasn't elite. Josh Adams was good, he wasn't elite. And so I think that's setting the stage for what I think is about to be the golden era. I mean, look, the foundation's got to be laid, right, Trevor? I mean, you got to lay the foundation first, then it becomes that greatness. And I think Notre Dame has a chance, whether it's this year or moving forward, to enter a period where you could look back and say Notre Dame can produce big-time running backs as well as or better than any team in the country. That is what I think, big picture, they're on the verge of, and I think it already started in recent seasons, especially last year with the emergence of Audric Estime.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I mean, you start to look at what the program has kind of transitioned to over the last, call it 8-9 years, close to a decade. And every program wants to get to the spot where, they're reloading, right? A lot of programs would see somebody losing a guy like Audric Estime, an 18 rushing touchdown guy, and say, well, who do they have left? Luckily for us, we are starting to build that recruiting pipeline up enough where we're recruiting dynamic players to come in, fill those roles, which is why there's been so much excitement around Jeremiah Love this year. It's because of what he's able to do on the field. You combine that with, all of the promise that Jadarian Price shows. Definitely a strong foundation moving forward for sure.
Let's get to the specifics of this, Trevor, and look at where Notre Dame is and what would it mean to be in a sort of golden age, and what does Notre Dame have to do to get there? And that's where I think the topic is going to. It's not what I think. I know that's where the topic is going to focus on because we get to determine the topics,
right?
Right. But when you look at running back, like as good as Kyron was. When you look at his college production, like somebody's pointing out what he did last year in the NFL, that's irrelevant to what he did at Notre Dame. I mean, Ricky Watters rushed for 10,000 yards. Ricky Watters never rushed for even 800 yards at Notre Dame. It's a different animal, right? But when you look at Kyron in the NFL or in college, Kyron was a good back, but he was a back that averaged 4.9 yards per carry his last season and only rushed for 1,002 yards in 9 games. When you look at where he was in 2021, he rushed for 1,125 yards and only 5.3 yards per carry. He was a very good college running back. He wasn't an elite college running back. The production wasn't elite, and the play wasn't elite. It just wasn't. And you could say the same thing about like Josh Adams. Josh Adams had outstanding production, but I would often argue that as much as I love Josh Adams, he was not one of the top backs in the country because he was more relying on, I would say, things like, could you imagine what Jonathan Taylor would have done in 2017 if he was running behind the Notre Dame offensive line?
Right.
What would have Ahmad Bradshaw done that year? What would some of those other, Royce Freeman, what would he have done running behind that? What would A.J. Dillon have done running behind that 2017 offensive line? And so it's not to diminish what Josh did or what Kyron did, but there's a level of, it was very good, and it was definitely good relative to what we've seen from past years at Notre Dame, but it wasn't elite from the standpoint of, okay, this football team has one of the premier game-changing backs. And so when I look at a guy like Kyron Williams, excellent player, but he wasn't on the same level of a Breece Hall. He wasn't on the same level of Najee Harris or even the 2 North Carolina running backs. They had 2 running backs that rushed for more yards than he did. And being okay to say he was a heck of a player, but he wasn't there. You look at 2021 when Kyron rushed for 1,000 yards. That year he finished the season, I'm just going to go yards per game and look at where he was yards per game. He that year ranked 48th nationally in rushing yards per game. Good back, not an elite back. He wasn't in the same league as Kenneth Walker. He wasn't in the same league as Breece Hall again. He wasn't in the same league as Bijan Robinson, Deuce Vaughn, guys like that, to where the difference to me for what Audric was last year, Trevor, is what makes Audric different is, number one, his production was among the best in college football. His 13 plus, 100 plus yards, his 18 rushing touchdowns. Last year, Audric finished 8th in college football in rushing yards per game. Kyron was 48th behind a pretty good offensive line in 2020. Actually 2021, he wasn't. In 2020, in yards per game, Kyron was 31st, behind what was a heck of an offensive line. Audric finished 8th last year. Audric also finished 3rd in rushing touchdowns last season. So we're talking about a guy that, Kyron ranked 19th in rushing touchdowns in 2019, and he ranked 10th in 2020. And let's see, all but 4 of the guys ahead of him played in fewer games than he did. Because if you remember, like Kenneth Walker had the same amount of rushing touchdowns as Kyron Williams in 2020. He played 8 games. Kyron played 12 because of COVID. The thing that's unique about Audric is the production, but also, Trevor, to me, he didn't do it behind an elite offensive line like Josh Adams had in 17, like Kyron had in 2020. I think that's another reason. It was more about how good Audric was, right, than the other. That's kind of why I look at it, say he was elite, not just his production was elite like it was for Josh Adams in 2017.
Yeah. I mean, the biggest difference for me too, in addition to the individual player being elite in Audric, is the consistency that he did it, right? With Josh Adams, with Kyron Williams, a lot of their highlight plays were these 50, 60, 70-yard touchdown runs, which, believe me, I've watched highlights of and loved in the moment, and it was fantastic. But I think what made Audric so great is knowing that he was able to go out and get 6 yards almost every time he touched the ball behind an offensive line that was decent, but in comparison to 2017 and 2020, it kind of pales in comparison. You know what I mean? So I think with Audric, what makes him elite, in addition to the other running backs you mentioned, Najee Harris, Breece Hall, those guys were consistent almost every time that they touched the football. And that, I think, is the strides that Notre Dame is starting to load up with in their running back room.
And that brings us to the present and then the future. And I believe that this is, like, Kyron was a good player, and I think some in the chat don't sometimes I feel like you can't say a guy wasn't elite, or people hear that as he sucked. Kyron was very good. And in 2021, Kyron was even more impressive in 2021 because he wasn't running behind a good offensive line. But there's a difference between being really good and being elite. And that's the difference. Kyron is very good. He wasn't elite. When I look at the aspect of where Notre Dame is now, and I look at the Jeremiah Loves, the Jadarian Prices, the Kedron Youngs, to a degree, Aeneas Williams, you start talking about 2 things. Number one, this is potentially elite level talent. Now, there's a lot to prove, but potentially elite level talent. There's a different type of athleticism and playmaking ability in the legs and mind of Jeremiah Love and Jadarian Price and Kedron Young even than what we've seen in past years, even compared to Audric, because of the speed difference with those guys compared to Audric. The other part of it is, in past years, it was in 2020, it was Kyron and Chris Tyree, and that's it. And same in 2021. In 2019, it was Tony Jones, and that was it. And in 2018, there was good depth in 2018, but there was a big drop off after really the first. It was Tony was a solid backup, but Tony was not an elite running back, a high level running back. He was a good college running back. There's a drop off after Dex in 2018. In 2017, you had a little nice 1-2 punch, but Dexter Williams had not emerged as a consistent guy and a guy you could depend on yet. The thing here now is, in past years, you lose your starter, you're in trouble. What's been different about Notre Dame the last couple years is, if you lose Audric or Audric struggles with fumbles in 2022, all right, Logan, go get us 100. And then vice versa. Last year, had Audric gone down, thank goodness he didn't, I think Notre Dame would have been okay with Jeremiah Love and Jadarian Price and Jabron Payne. And now you look at 2024 and you're like, Jeremiah could easily go out there and rush for over 1,000 yards. Jadarian could easily go out there and rush for 1,000 yards. And, heaven forbid that they lose both of those guys. Kedron Young's going to be a freshman All-American. Aeneas Williams may be a freshman All-American. One of those 2 guys will step up and emerge to where you can lose a guy like Jabron Payne and you're like, that stinks for him, but I think they're fine. And I think that's the difference. It's the waves that Notre Dame can throw, but just with all due respect to those other guys, Kyron was a smart player, wicked smart player, really good balance, really good agility, but he ran a 4.6 and he was little, right? Like, that's going to keep him from being sort of an elite back at the collegiate level. These guys not only have the size, but they have the elite athleticism to match. Now, we'll see if they have Kyron's heart. We'll see if they have Kyron's feel for things, but the raw talent is special. And you start talking about a guy. I mean, you and I were texting after the video came out on Sunday, and we're like, did you see what Kedron Young did to Don Schuler, who's had a great fall camp? Like, this running back room is absolutely loaded. And I think that's one of the things that's very different for me. High level is higher, and the depth is something like we haven't seen since Lou Holtz was the head coach, in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. The ceiling is higher than what it's been in previous years. You compound that with the depth. I mean, Notre Dame has, a 4-deep running back room, and that's not counting, unfortunately, Jabron Payne, who's out with a season-ending injury right now. So, call it he's healthy. We have 5 guys that could theoretically go to most schools in the country and fight for starter, if not be the bona fide starter. So that is a situation that Notre Dame hasn't been in a long time in the running back room. To your point, you've had your great players before in the past. You've had your Kyrens, and then we'll see what happens after him, right? But Notre Dame is in a spot right now that they have 4 guys right now that can all contribute to the offense, which I think is going to be a big indicator of how good this running back room is because I do think that all 4 of them will see their fair share of carries, more speaking the 2 younger guys, Ananias Williams and Kedron Young. But, historically, you got to be some special type of player to be getting minutes like that on a big name college football program like Notre Dame, which is why I'm excited for the future of this room and moving forward.
Here's another thing that factors into it, Trevor. When you talk about how you can attack opponents, what made the Lou Holtz era so fun to watch was you never knew which back was going to break out today. Is this when Mark Green dominates you? Is this when Anthony Johnson goes off on you? Is this when Rodney Culver goes off on you? I mean, in 1992, it's like, man, we gotta try and stop this Jerome Bettis guy. He's really good. Oh, who the heck is number 4? How do you stop all that? And then when you start talking about your number 2 guys and things like that, like you're talking about years where you've got Lee Becton and Randy Kinder and just a loaded depth chart. And back then you had to deal with the fullbacks. I mean, so like I remember, I think it was 1992 or no, it was 1993. One of the highlight runs of that season, obviously Lee Becton had a lot of them, but arguably the biggest highlight run of that season, I think it was 1993. I'm going to look up Notre Dame's 1993 schedule because those years some of those games can kind of bleed together, but I believe they played, no, it would have been 94? They played a home game against Purdue. It might have been 1994. I forget which year it was, but Ray Zellers had just a monster run. I mean, so you had to deal with the fullbacks back then too as runners. You had to deal with Mark Edwards after Ray Zellers left. And it just was kind of like, if one guy has a bad game, okay, fine. If Josh Adams had a bad game in 2017, you weren't going to be as good. If Darius Walker had a bad game back in 05 or 06, you were not going to be as good. I mean, you could go through the years and kind of talk about that and say, if this guy doesn't play well, you're in trouble. What was different about the Holtz era was they could just throw waves of backs at you, and it expands the margin for error, because if your starter doesn't have a good game, you're okay. Ride the hot horse. I mean, like last year in the bowl game's a perfect example. Jeremiah Love's a starter, a couple nice runs early, but overall they were bottling him up. I think he had like 39 yards on 12 carries. So what do? Try Ja'Jarian Price out there, and he goes for over 100. And then late Jeremiah makes a great, play for a touchdown on a reception. So it's hard to stop a team when you have this different type of, this depth of talent. And the other part too, Trevor, is some guys have a skill set that may be better suited for a particular defensive front compared to another. And that makes it also harder to where, like Josh Adams is a great vertical one cut and go guy. He wasn't a guy that if he had to make a lot of moves, he was going to be as effective. So when teams could kind of create smaller windows or throw off the timing of the run game, he would struggle. We saw that with Georgia in 2017. This Notre Dame team has different skill sets. So like if you need somebody to maybe hammer a little bit more, hey, this might be a Jadarian Kedron game, and we're going to use Jeremiah to get the ball maybe in space. If this is a slasher game, okay, this might be a Jeremiah game where, we're running outside zone and counter, and he's going to put his foot in the ground and just explode on you. And then we'll talk about Aeneas. He's similar to those other guys. So that's the other part of it too, Trevor, is you have different type of dynamic skill sets, which means you have less bad matchups for your team when playing the type of multiple different looks that Notre Dame's going to play, because they're not in the conference. They're not playing a similar style of play or similar style of athlete. And I think that's another thing that factors into what makes this backfield potentially so special and reminds me so much of the backfields I grew up watching, in the late 80s and early 90s.
Yeah. In addition to that, it mitigates the risk of becoming one-dimensional, right? That has been such a huge issue that I hear bounced around, in previous Notre Dame offenses. And a lot of people just hear one-dimensional and they think, well, they can only pass now or they can only run, which is true. But when you have an arsenal of players that, to your point, have such a wide range of skill sets, you're putting a defensive coordinator in a spot where you go from having to game plan for, 7-8 skilled guys to now you're doing 12 to 13 skilled guys, and that's what makes those multi-layered running back rooms, wide receiver rooms, insert position skill group here. That's what makes them so dangerous.
Now the question is going to be, okay, how are they going to produce this year? And we've talked a lot about that in past shows. And we'll talk more about this, you and I, as the season goes on, because Trevor's obviously going to have a very important role for what we're going to do here moving forward with a lot of our shows, including potentially being on the post-game shows and things along those lines. But, let's kind of glimpse into the future a little bit, Trevor. And this is part of the reason that I have some optimism as well. The only guy on the roster that is done after this year, like, sorry, we'd love to have you back, but you can't be back, is Devin Ford. Mm-hmm. Now, they may have, everybody's has transfers and things along those lines. But when you look at this room, I mean, Jeremiah Love couldn't go pro if he wanted to. He's only a sophomore. Jadarian Price, possibly could. He could possibly leave. But if Jadarian Price goes pro after this year, that's a good thing for Notre Dame. That means he had a monster season, right. And he was really good. You know what I mean? But and then you talk about those two, and we could talk about in 2-3 years, if your starting running back room or your running back depth chart is some combination of Kedron Young and Aeneas Williams, guess what? You're still loaded with elite players. They look different. Their style of play is going to be different, but you're loaded. And so the future, the immediate future, the next 2-3 years is potentially very bright. And then when you look at, okay, what about after that? The 25 running back class is solid, but not great. The more success these guys have now, the easier it's going to be to continue this level of recruiting in the future. And then part of the thing with the 25 class is it was not a great year running back wise anyway. And the fear that Notre Dame had is if we load up with other great running backs, then the portal is going to kill us. Whereas you bring in some program guys who can still play. Justin Thurman's a 4.4 guy. Daniel Anderson's from one of the best high schools in Arkansas, very good back, battled injuries last year, a Tony Jones type of back. It's good to have those kind of guys, because if their time ever comes, like it did for Tony Jones, who's the bridge player between Dex and Kyron, he's a pretty good running back, and if he was able to stay healthy that year, he probably goes for 1,000 yards. But those guys are necessary, but you're going to have to say, okay, but can they get back to that? I have no reason to think that they can't, because that's what they've done. I mean, Chris Tyree in 2020, you talk about in the 2021 class. Why am I drawing a blank on who the years get confused for me? I know 2021 was Logan and Aldrich. Mm-hmm. And then 2022 is Jadarian Price. And then 2023 or Andrew Braun Payne. 2023 is Jeremiah Love. 2024 is Kedron and Aeneas. They're going to recruit running back just fine, as long as Dylan McCullough is here. And of course, if he ever leaves, then Marcus Freeman will go hire somebody, that can do the same thing, because it was Lance Taylor that kind of got this thing rolling. Tony Alford is the guy that was the primary recruiter for that really good stretch in the late 20 teens with, he recruited Dexter, and he recruited Torian Folston, and he recruited Josh Adams, and he recruited a lot of those guys. So the future, Trevor, is this isn't a, hey guys, enjoy this season, because you're not going to have that next year. That's not where we're at with Notre Dame. It's kind of like, enjoy this and sit back, and we're going to be enjoying it for a while, because this depth chart is absolutely loaded for the present and the future. And that's one of those exciting things. Because, like, Trevor, haven't we been here before with Notre Dame, right? We're like, they're loaded in the present, but you're like, I hope this guy doesn't leave, because there's nobody like him. That's kind of, and we've seen that with some great players in the past, right? Where I hope this guy doesn't leave, because I don't know who's going to replace him. And that's a position where what makes this team overall different is you can lose a J.D. Bertrand and say, yeah, he's a heck of a player, 2-time captain, but they're going to replace him with Drake Bowen and Kingston Viliama-Asa. They're going to be all right. And that's kind of how I feel about running back, where you can lose at Audric Estime and say, he was a great player, going to miss him, but they're going to be fine. And that's something that's very different about being a Notre Dame fan right now. And we are Notre Dame fans. I mean, we're analysts and we're going to be objective, but we're also both grew up as Notre Dame fans. So we have a different perspective. That's what makes this unique, is it's Notre Dame has finally entered reload mode at running back. Not rebuild, reload. And that's an exciting time to be in.
It's starting to become eerily similar to, which is a good thing, to what the offensive line has been doing over the last, really call it since we had Zach Martin. I remember, going back through and thinking, after that combination left, after, Zach Martin and Chris Watt on the left side, and 2013, I think, was their last year. And then it's like, okay, well, now who? And then you enter in Ronnie Stanley, right? And then you start thinking, okay, well, Ronnie Stanley, he was a top pick in the draft. Well, then who do you have? And you just start to see this pattern of reloading, to your point of, yes, recruiting can be as awesome as you need it to. Marcus Freeman is a good recruiter, but the product on the field is what's going to sell your program and what's going to sell the school. So I think with a lot of the success that Notre Dame running backs have seen, since 2015 with CJ Prosise, is new, younger recruits can look at what's happening on the field and say, hey, look, I can go there and, make a name for myself and give myself the best chance to make it to the NFL. Right.
And it's okay if I don't play right away. I can be patient, because look what Jeremiah did. He kind of was the number 2, only rushed for 385 as a freshman. Jadarian in his first 2 years, only 284, was it 286 last year? What was his number last year? I can't believe I'm forgetting this. Where was, let me see here, Jadarian Price rushing. He was at 272 last year. But they stuck him back on kick returns, and he averaged over 34 yards a kick, had a big return. They found a way to use those guys. And then when Audric left, they slide right into that role. And then when those guys leave, Kedron and Nia slide right into that role. Part of what worked for Bama so well for so many years, and why they could get 5-star kids that you knew were going to sit for 2 years, and they knew they were going to sit for 2 years and be happy about it, is because they knew, I don't have to be a 4-year starter at Alabama. I can be a 1-year starter, and I'm going to be a first or second round draft pick.
Yeah.
And that helps as well. That's why so many Notre Dame offensive linemen over the years were willing to sign, knowing they were going to sit for a couple years. I remember talking to Liam Eichenberg, and he was telling me how Urban Meyer's, one of his pitches to try to get, Liam to go to Ohio State was, you're going to get a play right away for us. And he was like, I don't want to play right away, because he had bought into Coach Heastand's pitch that you're going to come here, you're going to sit behind, Mike McGlinchey and Alex Bars, and then when your time comes, you're going to have been groomed by some elite linemen. And Liam was like, yeah, that sounds good. And that's exactly what happened. Liam didn't start until his 3rd year, 2018. And then he's a 3-year starter and an All-American on his own and a 2nd-round pick. When that track record is established, then guys are going to be more willing to say, I'm going to go be part of a loaded backfield, knowing that number 1, they're going to use a lot of guys. And number 2, even if I have to, be a number 2 or number 3 for a year, be successful. And then the pitch that Dylan McCullough can have too is, look, you don't want to be a guy that goes to college and carries the ball 1,000 times in 3 years. NFL teams nowadays aren't going to like that. They don't want all that tread being put on your tires. And so you come here, you have 2 years of being a good rotation guy, 1 year as a breakout starter. Next thing you know, boom, you're in the National Football League as a high draft pick. So there's a lot of that they can sell if the results in the field match it. And that's the thing that's helping them in recruiting is, look, guys like Josh Adams, guys like Kyron Williams, guys like Dexter Williams, they laid the foundation for the present, because they showed you can go to Notre Dame, rush for 1,000, be part of teams that are going to play in the postseason, and have the production. And that laid the foundation. It made it easier to land Chris Tyree. It made it easier to land Audric Estime and Logan Diggs. It made it easier to land Jadarian Price and Jeremiah Love and Kedron Young and those type of guys, because they can now visualize, hey, I know what it looks like to be a 1,000-yard back in Notre Dame. I just watched it. I watched Kyron Williams sit the bench an entire season, come out the next year and take over the starting role and rush for 1,000 yards. Kyron went from 6 carries in 2019 to back-to-back 1,000-yard seasons, right? Heck, they even had a guy move from receiver and rush for 1,000 yards not that long ago. You know what I mean? So the results have to match for the recruiting pitch to really be effective. And I think that's a big thing that's really helped is even though I said what I said earlier about Kyron, and it's true, Trevor, he was a very good back, not an elite back in college.
Yeah.
He was still really fun to watch, and watching him produce, I believe, showed Logan Diggs, showed Audric Estime, showed those guys that I can go to Notre Dame, and if he can do that and run a 4.58 at the combine, what could I do? And that's part, like, so Kyron to me was part of laying that foundation for why the roster is what it is now. And then, of course, hiring competent coaches who don't mind recruiting always helps. You know what I mean? And that was a difference as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And almost on the flip side of that coin, one thing that the coaching staff now, in comparison to previous regimes, that they do well is there is some aspect of you do recruit high octane caliber players with that high ceiling. Now they're comfortable saying, hey, listen, I'm not going to say that you're going to go out and get 100 carries this year. But what I can say is you can help our team in a positive way, and you will see the field in some capacity. I mean, think of Jeremiah Love. Yes, he would come in some relief situations, almost like a change of pace back. He also had a fake punt run against Duke, kind of keep the offensive momentum alive on the first drive of the game for them. So, their commitment to saying, hey, come here, you will have your time, right? To your point, we've seen it with Kyron Williams. We've seen it with these former players that kind of had to wait their turn to show what their true abilities were, but we will find ways to get you onto the field to help us in some capacity, which I think is another game changer. I mean, Alabama, you referenced earlier, they do it too, right? They did it for years. I mean, there's that one iconic picture where in one room they had TJ Yeldon and Alvin Kamara and Derrick Henry and all of these guys. And, I guess it also helps when you're beating opponents 59-0. Everybody can see the field at that point. I might have gotten some.
But Trevor, can't Notre Dame now kind of sell that based on last year?
Absolutely.
Like, guys, we scored over 40 points 9 times last year. We won 10 games. 9 of those wins were by at least 21 points. So that's a great point, is that, yeah, you're still going to get a play. And you were referencing that, Jeremiah and Jadarian having a role to put some data to the point you're making. Last year, Jeremiah had 681 total yards last year. So he only had 272 rushing and he had 65 receiving, but he had 344 kick return yards. They found a way to have him make an impact. Jeremiah Love last season had 504 yards, 385 rushing, 77 receiving, and 42 kick returns. So your 2 running backs who were clear number 2 and 3 to your 1,318 touchdown rushing running back still combined for almost 1,200 yards last season in various ways. That's exactly to your point of they can show, and that's what happened in the Holtz era. Is guys would find other things to do until their time came. Hey, Ricky Waters, what do you want to do? Start at receiver or be our 4th string running back? Take your pick. And so he went out and was a starter and had a huge impact. I mean, Ricky wasn't a running back in 1988, but I don't know that they beat Michigan if he doesn't have that 81-yard punt return at the end to start that game. It's the only touchdown they scored the whole game. He was able to still have an impact. And when you're selling that and you're winning, it makes it easier to keep that recruiting going. And that's the thing that's going to be key about this team, even more so than last year, is I want to see if this staff can find a way to utilize more than one back as a focal point of the offense. Mike Denbrock's never, in my opinion, never had the type of tandem he's going to have now. Because you could argue in 2015 he could have if Torian doesn't go down.
Sure.
But did we really know what CJ Prosise was yet at that time going into the season as a converted receiver? I don't know that we did. But going into a season with this type of depth of talent, he had a heck of an explosive running back at Cincinnati and Jerome Ford, but there was a big drop-off between Jerome Ford and who his number 2 and his number 3s were. LSU last year had a lot of good backs, but, Logan Diggs was your number 1. He was number 2 at Notre Dame, and then there was a big drop-off, from him to, where potentially Notre Dame can be in future seasons. So that's the other thing too, is we've got to see if this coaching staff can figure out how to use these guys without getting them out of rhythm. And that's a challenge. That's easier said than done. That's just, you got these 4 running backs, use them. Yeah, that's fine. But running backs need to get into a rhythm of a game. And it can be hard to do that when you've got 4 different guys playing a lot of snaps. So it's a challenge. And that's going to be something that we're going to have to find out if the staff could do. That could be sort of that final piece to this puzzle, so to speak. I'm optimistic they will, but there's still a level to that. I mean, Trevor, you played football. You understand what I'm talking about. It's you can't just say this isn't NCAA 2000, CFB 2025, right? Where you just put your next running back in and he's just going to be just as good because you're the one who's got the eyes in that game, not the player. And that's something that they're going to have to figure out. How do you rotate these guys and how do you use them all while making sure that they can also get into a rhythm of the game, which is, I think, very important for a running back.
And that's where we have, at least I have, very full confidence in Dylan McCullough. And as a coach, when you have that much of a loaded running back room, you kind of have to know when to keep somebody and when to pull them at the right moments. Sure, there's certain down and distance scenarios that, you would want to keep a certain guy in over another. I mean, Jabron Payne was almost like the third down back last year, it felt like. But I think, to your point, letting somebody get in a rhythm is so important, and knowing when to ride that out, and don't just change up personnel for the sake of saying, all right, defense, how are you going to stop us this time? It's like, well, they couldn't stop the previous guy. So let's, slow up on the reins a little bit and see if we can get them into a rhythm. I agree for sure.
So that's kind of where we are, Trevor. I would say my conclusion is Notre Dame has snuck up on the rest of college football when it comes to production at running back. Going back to 2017, Notre Dame has had they had a 1,000-yard rusher in 17, 18 and 19 they did not, because for different reasons, and it came down to their leading backs missing time. 2021 they had a 1,000-yard rusher. You look at the two-man combination and the production they had in 2022. What I'm going to be curious about is it going to be this year's production going to be similar to that? Nobody gets to 1,000, but they both have a bunch, or does one of them kind of emerge as more of the primary runner and go over 1,000? That's going to be interesting to see. But I think Notre Dame has snuck up on the rest of college football at running back and are on the verge of kind of, like somebody said, Athlon Sports, who, my irishbreakdown.com website's affiliated with, released their 20 top backfields in college football. I have Notre Dame in it. Like I'm looking at the preseason magazines. I don't think any of them had Notre Dame in the top 10. I think that's going to change by season's end. But the reason for that, in my opinion, is because Notre Dame doesn't have that track record at running back. I think that's starting to change. And that's why I say we're not in that golden age yet. But my prediction is it begins in 2024. I think that's when they kick the door down and say, hey, this team's recruiting running back as well as anybody in the country. Not many teams can lose Audric Estime and come out the next year, and you're like, they're actually more dangerous now than they were last year because nobody's got Audric's size and power, but they're way faster than what they were last year, way more explosive. And oh, by the way, now you have a quarterback you have to deal with who's a pretty good athlete as well, which Audric didn't have that last year. If you wanted to crash the backside on Audric, have at it because there was no answers for Notre Dame. There will be answers now, and that's going to make this group even more dangerous.
Yeah, I mean, like how we talked about how, Josh Adams and Dexter Williams, they started to build out the foundation, CJ Prosise, for Notre Dame being a relevant school for, a top, I would call it a top destination for highly touted running back recruits to go to. I think Audric Estime is kind of laying that foundation for that golden age that we're talking about, that kind of introduces Notre Dame to that next level of, hey, yes, we've had some solid guys before in the past. We've had some guys go off to the league like Kyron Williams rush for over 1,000 yards last year just through 12 games in a 17-game season. And that was a guy who, I mean, you could make the argument that Jeremiah Love and Jadarian Price, from a skill set perspective, have a higher ceiling than Kyron Williams ever did. And that's no knock on Kyron. He was fantastic. Back-to-back 1,000-yard seasons. I think he racked up like 29 rushing touchdowns in 2 years between 2020 and 2021. But I think Audric Estime and what he did last year, to your point of we have a 1,300-yard rusher and an 18 rushing touchdown guy leave, and we are at the very minimum staying at the same level. An argument could be made for we are getting better, which I know we'll get into here later today, but it's exciting stuff to see and think about.
That's going to do it for this segment of the show. We got more coming up, so don't go anywhere. But before we do get to part 2, do me a favor, folks. Hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, share this podcast, give us a 5-star review on your podcast platforms of choice. And of course, if you have not done so, sign up for the message board at boards.irishbreakdown.com. First perk Trevor got was his membership that he paid for got turned into a comped membership. That's one of the perks of being here. You don't have to pay to post on the sites you work for. So that's always a good thing, right? I'm not that cheap. So definitely want to sign up for that at boards.irishbreakdown.com. Definitely check that out. Tons and tons of great conversation coming up. And as we get closer and closer to the season. So before we get into part 2 of today's show, a couple quick things, people. Number one, a reminder, tonight's IB Nation Sports Talk will not start until 6 o'clock. Sean and Vince will be with you guys tonight, but there's a little bit of a scheduling snafu that came about that they'll probably talk to you about tonight that I just wanted to kind of dive into and just make sure that you guys are aware. 6 p.m. start time tonight for IB Nation Sports Talk. We also had a couple super chats. Pete Weber gave a super chat. Thank you very much for that, Pete. He says, Trevor has a great radio voice. Welcome aboard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I appreciate it. I haven't never really thought about a career in radio, but I'm sure Lauren, my fiance, may or may not disagree with you, but I think that's just because she listens to me talk too much. But I appreciate that.
Also, my guy Raymond Tittman hurt my feelings a little bit. He said he followed that up response with Bryan has a face for radio, which I kind of stung a little bit there, Raymond. That stung a little. I'm not gonna lie to you. Super chat from AST12321. Am I coping by thinking? Thank you for the super chat, my friend. Am I coping by thinking offense winning the Jersey scrimmage is a positive sign on the O line? Can't imagine O wins if the O line couldn't somewhat handle a great D line. Well, it could mean that. I don't want to say for sure that it does, because it could also mean something that I don't think enough people are putting conversation into, which is if you have an offensive line that's just okay or struggling, when you have a quarterback like Riley Leonard and the kind of versatility that Notre Dame has at running back, which you just talked about, there's a lot of things you can do to spread teams out and also take advantage of an aggressive defensive line and a blitzing team. And Notre Dame didn't have those options last year. They have those options this year. But look, Notre Dame lost the Jersey scrimmage in the spring. They won it in the fall. I mean, that's not an end-all be-all and doesn't determine anything, but it's not a bad sign that they now won the Jersey scrimmage. You know what I mean? And the scoring is the same in the spring as it was in the fall. And so obviously that's an improvement. I think what it shows is that, Notre Dame's offensive line is not going to be elite this year, but I don't think it's going to suck. Like I think a lot of people think it's going to suck. This is not going to be the 2021 offensive line, in my opinion. This isn't going to be some of the lines from past years like 07. This is going to be like 07 line. The difference between this line and that line is this line actually has a lot of talent. It's just not as experienced. And experience on the O-line is incredibly important. That's why I don't think it's going to be a great offensive line either. But it's better than what I think a lot of people are giving it credit for. And look, Trevor, I said this yesterday. My biggest beef, one of my big beefs with Joe Rudolph, but the one at the top was I felt he went with the safe choices too often in the starting lineup. He should have played Billy Schrauth more last year. He didn't. He went with the older, safer choices, and I criticized him for it. How am I now going to criticize him because he's going with the more talented guys over the more experienced guys, right? I've said consistently, if it's close between a veteran player and a younger guy that's got significantly more talent, if all the other things are close, you go with the more talented player, in my opinion. Now, if the more experienced guy is here and the more talented guy is here from their development, then you go with that. Like, that's why Gerby Lambert's not starting. People I've talked to have said this kid has got first-round NFL draft pick written all over him. He's just not ready yet. He's not. It's not close between him and the other guys. With Anthony Knapp, it is. With Sam Pendleton and Sullivan Absher, it is. So that's why they're in that battle. And if it's close and all the assignment stuff, you go with the more talented player, because Pat Coogan and Rocco Spindler and Tosh Baker aren't going to get better with playing more games. They are what they are. These young guys have a chance to get better. And so I'm not going to criticize the guy for doing exactly what I asked him to do last year. Now, it's unfortunate that you're having to do this everywhere on your offensive line because you're going to be so young. But I again, it's they're putting their best foot forward from a talent standpoint. And that always is going to say, hey, look, you're going to take some lumps early, but you're doing it because they're thinking once we get to games 8 through 12 and then in the postseason, this line gives us the best chance after they've kind of gone through some growing pains of helping this team be the best it can be in the second half of the year and in the postseason.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm very encouraged at the fact that we are, as a program, putting emphasis on skill and potential and taking their ceiling into account before we just throw the older guy in there, right? To your point, if the older guy is the best fit, and like the Gerby Lambert situation, sure, absolutely. I think pertaining to this super chat, I think, and I struggle with this too a lot, is until we see it in week 1, we kind of have to live in the world of gray, which is so tough, right? I mean, we hear one good thing about the offensive line, and then on one hand, you got, man, the O-line's actually going to be 10 times better than what we thought. And then on the flip side of the coin, it's, well, what does that mean about the D-line? Does that mean they're bad now?
Yeah.
Are they not going to get the pass rush that we need? Well, I think that both could be false, but I think it's living in that world of gray, right?
Based on how the message board has been acting the last couple of days, I think the answer is going to be, well, now I'm worried about the D-line. They're going to be terrible now. That's kind of, yeah. I think where some people are, they're just kind of hitting that panic mode a little bit as the season's right around the corner, but we're going to see how that plays out. So, but no, it's not a negative. There's, in practicality, there's nothing negative about the Notre Dame offense winning the Jersey scrimmage, especially since the context is they lost it in the spring and last fall. With Joe Walt and Blake Fisher, they also barely won the Jersey scrimmage last year too. And, so, and I think this defense is ahead of where they were a year ago. So I think it's a good sign. So that's just something to consider. We have another super chat, but it's going to be, it plays into our next topic. So I'll bring that up here as we get a little bit closer to that. So we'll bring that up as we go. So that's going to kind of conclude that little segue. Part 2 of today's show, Trevor. Let's dive into, this is the topic that I think is going to be the most fun to talk about. And we're going to talk over the next little bit about the Notre Dame 2024 team in relation to where they were last year, and then to a degree with some of these topics where they've been in previous seasons. And this, for me, is where my optimism comes from. Because when I look at this football team and I think about where they were a year ago, and not just in fall camp, but then how the season played out. I think what some fans might be missing is that while they will be less experienced in certain positions, this is a far more talented football team, in my opinion. And we're seeing the fruits of the Marcus Freeman recruiting, Chad Bowden recruiting, Mike Mickens recruiting, Al Washington, and Mike Elston to a degree recruiting with some of the younger guys. But what Al Washington has done in recent years, Deland McCullough, and Harry Heastan is an offensive line recruiter for his one class. And then, of course, what Joe Rudolph has done as a recruiter as well. I think we're going to see the fruits of that start to shine this year. So what we're going to do in this next segment, we're going to begin with the offense and then go to the defense and discuss where we believe Notre Dame is better and not as good as they were a year ago. And it's just, we're going to leave that as open as possible. We're not going to narrow it too much so we can convince ourselves to get the answers that we want. We're going to leave it as open as possible. And then one thing we will do, we did have a super chat from Raymond Tittman, and answer this, Raymond, even though you made me a little sad earlier with your comments. But he said, Bryan, when you compare last year to this year, can you give a key stat to watch for to measure whether your predictive analysis was right? I'll do that when I can, Raymond, but a lot of it's just going to come down to, some of it will be statistical, but you could be better statistically in a place and not be as good as an offense. I don't know that last year's offense was as good as 2015's, but they averaged more yards per pass attempt and averaged, they didn't average more yards per rush. They were almost identical in yards per play. They averaged more points per game. But if you were to ask me if I have to go, play Ohio State, do I want the 15 offense or the 23 offense? I'm taking the 15 offense, right? So stats don't always tell you the story because there's a lot of other context that goes into it. But I will do my best in certain areas where I think the statistics will measure. And this is really going to come into play for two positions for me, running back and linebacker. And so I'll do my best to provide that when I can. But Like, I don't expect Riley Leonard to have as good of a yards per pass attempt number as what Sam Hartman did last year for a host of reasons. So, but I think he'll be more impactful because I think the offense is going to be different. So we will provide that, Raymond, when we can, and I do appreciate the super chat on that. But we're going to begin with the offense, Trevor. And we're going to talk about, we're going to go position by position and then wrap it up with overall. And, of course, the place to begin is at quarterback. And so when we talk about better, is the current group better than last year? There's really three aspects to it. Number one is obviously the starter. That matters more than the depth. The starter's important. You don't just say, well, they've got their 4 is better than last year's 4, but there's this huge gap at number 1. Well, guess what? Then, then that may be last year's group is better. Depth doesn't always equal better if the guy from previous was that much better than who they have now. The depth is important, though, and we'll talk about that. And when we talk about better, it's going to come down to how do you impact the game? Can this group impact the game greater than last year's group? And so that's what we're going to kind of get into, and it starts at quarterback. And you will go from Sam Hartman, Steve Angeli, and Kenny Minchey last year to Riley Leonard, Steve Angeli, Kenny Minchey, and CJ Carr this year. And so, Trevor, to begin, when you look at the quarterback room, tell me which one you think is better and then why you think it's better or not as good as of right now as what the room was, how it played out last season.
Sure. I get starting with the starter, the guy under center now. I like this year's starter, Riley Leonard, better than where we were at last year for a host of reasons. Simply put, I think he's a more dynamic playmaker. That is something that Notre Dame has been lacking at the quarterback position for a while. I think they might have found that in Riley Leonard. Again, we'll see it here in about 10 days or so, but who's counting? I am. But, I think in comparison to last year, there were a lot of expectations with Sam Hartman coming into the season based off of what he did at Wake Forest. And then when you break it down, different styles of offense, different cadence style. And in interviews before, Riley Leonard said that there's a lot of similarities with what he did at Duke, coming into now what he's doing with Denbrock. So starting with the starter, I like where we're at. And then the quarterback room as a whole, I would say I would take this year's as well. Because not only do I think the ceiling was raised, I think the floor has been raised too. With the addition of CJ Carr. And just it's another year of development that Kenny and Steve have both had. And I think that I would take the 2024 quarterback room over where we had it last year. I think of in terms of if Riley Leonard were to go down, I am more comfortable this year than in comparison to if Sam Hartman gets hurt last year. I think there's a lot more questions of, well, what do we do? And that's where I'm at.
It's interesting. The dynamic of what happened after each player committed to Notre Dame it has to factor into this. And when Sam committed to Notre Dame, the expectation was he was going to play for Tommy Rees. And I think he would have performed better in the Tommy Rees offense than he did in Jared Parker's offense for a number of reasons. And that's not saying Jared Parker was better or worse. It's just different. It's about style fit. Riley Leonard committed to Notre Dame, I believe it was before Jared Parker left. And then, of course, he leaves and Mike Denbrock arrives. The big difference is Mike Denbrock is a much better fit for Riley Leonard than what Jared Parker's offense would have been. And so I think that dynamic plays into it. But I'll be honest, Trevor. I mean, there's no question that Riley Leonard is going to be better than what Sam Hartman was last year. I mean, if all Riley Leonard does is repeat what he did in 2022, he's a better quarterback than what Sam Hartman was for Notre Dame last year. I mean, it's honestly not really that close when you look at what Sam did last year. Now, I think a lot of what happened with Sam last year was outside his control. And I've talked a lot about that. I don't really care to get into that again. Some of it was on him. Some of it was bad luck. Some of it was a lot of other things. But, last year, Sam Hartman passed for 2,689 yards and completed 63.5% of his passes and had 24 touchdowns and 8 picks. rushed for 123 yards and 3 touchdowns. So he averaged 234.3 yards of offense per game, and averaged, he was a good, steady, solid quarterback. When you look at Riley Leonard passed for 2,967 yards. Now, that was in one more game than what Sam played. He had 20 touchdowns and 6 picks. Not a whole lot different from what Sam did, although he had a higher completion percentage. He was at 63.8. Sam was at 63.5. The difference is here. Sam Hartman rushed for, as I mentioned, 123 yards and 3 touchdowns. Riley Leonard rushed for 699 yards and 13 touchdowns. Sam Hartman last season had 2,812 total yards and 27 total touchdowns. He averaged 234.3 yards per game. Riley Leonard had 3,666 yards of offense, 33 touchdowns, and averaged 282 yards per game than what Sam Hartman did last year. And I don't see any scenario in which Riley Leonard is less productive at Notre Dame than he was at Duke in 2022. You can complain all you want about the offensive line, but even with the offensive line perceived issues, he still is going to have a significantly better supporting cast around him than he did at Duke in 2022. He's also going to have a better defense at Notre Dame than he had at Duke in 2022. Now, the 2023 Duke defense was very good. It's still not as good as Notre Dame's, but it's very good. But he didn't have that in 2022. They were a solid defense, and any defense that Mike Elko has is going to be solid. But you saw against the offenses with more talent that they'd give up a lot more points. Is fact. So the supporting cast is going to be better. I think that's really what it comes down to for me when a starter. Sam Hartman is not as good of a player as Riley Leonard. And I'll be honest, I mean, anyone that knows my opinion on Sam Hartman versus Riley Leonard, I expected Sam Hartman to be better last year, but I've always felt Riley Leonard was the better quarterback. You could just go back and watch those two guys go at it in 2022 when Sam Hartman or Riley Leonard outdueled Sam Hartman in a Duke win over Wake Forest. And you see how he impacts the game differently. And that's something that Notre Dame desperately needs, in my opinion, this season. So the starter alone makes it better. But as you mentioned, the depth chart, not only is CJ here, Trevor, but Steve Angeli's a year older and Kenny Minchie's a year older. So they're both better versions of themselves last year. If they remain 2 and 3 and CJ stays 4 and he's on scout team all year, it's still better. If CJ Carr wouldn't have signed with Notre Dame, it'd still be better because you'd have the same 2 and 3, but they're both now a year older. And so I think all those things factor into why, to me, quarterback is in a much better position. And the final thing is, last year you had a quarterback that was dependent upon what happened around him. As good as Sam Hartman was, he needed the line to block for him, and he needed the receivers to catch the ball, and he needed the receivers to get open and those type of things. Riley Leonard doesn't always need that. And that's an element, as you mentioned, that Notre Dame needs and now has at quarterback. And I also think they're in a better position to win if he goes down than they were last year to win if Sam went down and you had sophomore version of Steve Angeli and freshman version of Kenny Minchie. You're now better off with junior year version of Steve Angeli, who started a bowl game, threw for 700 yards last year. You're in a much better position now to win with him now than you were a year ago. Same thing is true as Kenny Minchie. And then you throw CJ into the mix, and it's very obvious that quarterback to me is in a much better position than it was a year ago. And so I think that's a no-brainer. This one is going to be a little different. This is a little bit more debatable. Running back. You've got Audric. You had Audric last year. You lose him. He's now gone. You had Jeremiah Love last year. He's now a year older. Jadarian's a year older. Jabron's out. You add Devin Ford still there. You add Keidron Young and Aeneas Williams. So just there's a lot of ways to look at it. You lose Audric and you lose Jabron. You add Keidron and you add Aeneas. Which room is better?
This one was tough for me because it's tough to say that the running back room gets better when you are losing 18 rushing touchdowns. For me, call it a cop-out answer. I'm not going to say they are better. I think that they are deeper. In that they have, like we had talked about before in the previous segment, is there's now 4 guys realistically that can come in and contribute in a multitude of different ways. But like I said, it's just hard for me to say that it is better after losing somebody like Audric. But I do think that the ceiling is higher, I guess, if that makes sense, because of the different ways that they can contribute. That would be my answer for how to look at the rooms in comparison 23 to 24.
I've been back and forth on this one, Trevor. Yesterday on the message board, somebody asked me, or 2 days ago when this conversation happened, I said running back was better. And then I was like, no, it's not better. And then I'm back to, yes, it is better. And I'm back to, I think it's kind of a wash. And I that's why I'm having a hard time saying better or worse. I will say this, it's better than where it was a year ago at this time. We thought Audric was going to break out. We didn't know for sure. You didn't quite know where Jadarian Price was health-wise. You didn't know what he's going to be able to provide. You didn't know what Jadarian was going, or Jeremiah was going to do. So I feel better about the running back room today than I did on August 20th of 2023. After the season played out and how good Audric was, it's a much tougher call. I think you are correct. They are deeper this year of guys ready to play. Are they better? That's a much tougher question to ask. They're less established, but they're more dynamic. Which one matters more? They're not as big as they were last year, but they're more explosive. I mean, so there's every time I think of, well, this is advantage 2023, I have a counter to 2024. Every time I think 2024 is going to be better, I have a counter to 2023. One thing that is going to be very interesting is you mentioned the touchdown thing. Last year, Notre Dame, some of the mistakes they made, like you had 2 4th downs against Ohio State, and neither time your stud running back touched the ball, right? Like that was a coaching mistake. I felt better about Notre Dame lining up on 3rd and 1, 2nd and 1 goal line situations, saying they're going to get a touchdown because of not just Audric, but also Jabron. When in his situations, I mean, he's the one that caught that. I mean, behind his back, tough throw touchdown against USC. Jabron was a pretty good red zone guy as well.
Yep.
That's how well they can fill that void. If I had more confidence in that I knew the answer to that, I'd probably go with 2024. Because that's a difference between field goals and touchdowns. I mean, your guys were dynamic and got you inside the 5, but once you got inside the 5, you weren't as good. Of course, now you have the Riley Leonard fact of that as well, which adds to it. But that 3rd and short and goal to go situations is going to ultimately determine the difference. Because I think this group's going to be more explosive. This group is going to be more dynamic. This group is going to be much more impactful in the pass game than last year's running back room. But will this room be as good at getting the tough yards? When the offensive line was not playing well last year, Audric could still get his. Can this group do that? Those are the things that are going to determine what that answer is, Trevor, because again, I could sit there and tell y'all right now it's the 24 group, and I promise you we're going to be midway through tight ends. I'm going to be thinking, man, I should probably change my answer and rectify that. You know what I mean? Like, that's what I've been the last 2 days. So I don't know that I have a good answer here. It's kind of a wash for me, but I think it's got the potential to be a lot better as a group. But I think it's far from given because of what we knew about what Audric brought to the table.
I think another thing, too, that I want to factor in is the scheme that the running backs would be playing in. I think that's kind of an unsung thing. Looking at it apples to apples, it's so tough to say, well, who would you rather have, Audric or Jeremiah? It's like, well, they're both respectively great at 2 of the things that they need them to do. If I were to say, you know what, the offense this year is going to be very pro style. We're lining up with 2 tight ends and we're running it downhill. Yeah, I'm going to go with Audric. I mean, because the dude was a load. He was 230 pounds and was getting 6 yards a carry, half the time on accident just because he couldn't be stopped. Whereas if you were to ask me, hey, we're going to spread it out this year, we're going to run a little bit more tempo. We need the running backs to be able to catch out of the backfield. We might send some in motion. Would you rather have Jeremiah Love or Audric? My answer would be Jeremiah Love. So I do think scheme plays a little bit of a factor in that. Now, I think it's tough to, like I said, compare it even and just taking 2 players and say, who would you rather have? But for their respective systems, if I were to give a hard cut answer, I would say I would take this running back room in 2024 for the system that we have in 2024. And that's probably where I'll cut it even.
I like that. I like that. And last year we did see those two young guys look pretty good in some of the bigger moments. And you sometimes often wonder, why didn't they do that more? Jeremiah averaged over 7 yards a carry against Ohio State last year. He looked good. He only had eight touches though. That was the problem, right? Like he should have maybe touched a little bit more, and Audric should have touched a little bit more. Jadarian with what he did against USC, and so I'll say this is a no-brainer. I cannot wait to see if this group can be better because I think it's going to be a fun group to watch. This next one is going to be a little bit easier. Wide receiver. Completely different group than it was a year ago. Completely different group. No Rico Flores, no Tobias Merriweather, no Chris Tyree. Deion Colsey was a regular at the beginning of the season before injuries, and Chancey Stuckey kind of ruined his season. You have no Braylon James as the young potential standout. And we did not know a whole lot about Jordan Faison at this time a year ago. Fast forward to a year, all those guys are gone. You welcome the three freshmen into the team: Cam Williams, Micah Gilbert, Logan Soldate. That'd be exciting enough, in my opinion. But now you add Chris Mitchell out of the portal, Bo Collins out of the portal, and Jaden Harrison out of the portal. Plus, now you have sophomore versions of Jaden Greathouse and Jordan Faison and Jaden Thomas and Deion Colsey. I know the answer. I'm pretty sure I know the answer. Which room is better? The 24 receivers or the 23 receivers?
24 receivers. And to your point, this was not that hard of a decision to make. I mean, I think the overall potential of this room is better. You're adding more additional experience with Chris Mitchell and Bo Collins and Jaden Harrison. The young guys have gotten better. And the newcomers in the three freshmen, I think that could see legitimate minutes this year. The thing I like about this receiving room is it's very diversified in their skill sets. I felt like last year they had like 6 guys that could all do the same thing, right? And this year you have kind of your segmented groups. They almost have their own verticals, if you will. I mean, you have your deep threat guys. You have KK Smith, and you have Chris Mitchell, and then you have your boundary receivers, kind of your guys that they're not going to torch anybody, but they could be your go-to guys. They're going to be open in the middle of the field, and Jaden Thomas and Bo Collins and Jaden Greathouse, and then you have your quick, speedy slot guys, and that can make moves in the open field with Faison and with Jaden Harrison, who I've been seeing getting reps in fall camp in the slot. So I think that this year everything is more diversified, and everything has been geared towards making this offense so multifaceted that it's just going to be almost impossible to game plan for him, which I love. So short answer, 2024 receiving room.
This is Irish Breakdown. We don't do short answers. and agree completely. I think the diversity point you've talked about, Trevor, I've hammered that all summer. I think that's a great point. You have, and here's why that matters. Number one, it gives you different ways to attack teams. But again, when you have the same group of players, they may be great one week when you're playing a team that's not geared towards being able to defend that type of thing. When I talked about this in 2018, one of the reasons that the pass offense had some issues against Clemson, even though I thought the receivers were open more than they got the ball, what it came down to, you had 2 big guys for Notre Dame, and Clemson had 2 corners in Trayvon Mullen and A.J. Terrell who could handle big guys better than anybody else that they played. And so that window was smaller, and Ian Book didn't feel comfortable throwing into it. Now, I thought the receivers played well, but the windows looked way different for Ian, and he wouldn't pull the trigger. And so now you say, okay, well, if you're playing a team that's like got a bunch of 5'9" corners who can't, hey, maybe we see combinations where Bo and Jaden Thomas and Micah Gilbert are on the field together. Or they're playing a team that's got some big corners, but they're kind of not real shifty. And so all of a sudden we're seeing a lot more of Chris Mitchell and KK and Jaden Greathouse and Jordan Faye. You can match up differently. And to teams that can take one thing away, you have answers in other areas. And we haven't even talked about the tight end room and how that's going to impact the pass game and how these guys are going to complement that. The final piece for me, Trevor, is just what we know. Last year, I thought the receiving core was going to be better than it was. I think it was better than it was, meaning there were more opportunities there that should have worked had the coaching been better or the quarterback play been better or the O-line play been better. And we'll get into that here as we get into the season, but it still wasn't as good as it could have been. because you were dealing with a lot of ifs. If this guy can help you as a freshman, if this guy can play, if this guy steps up, if this guy can be healthy, if Jaden Thomas would have been healthy last year, he would have had a 50-plus catch, 700-yard season. Why do I say that? How do I know that? Because that's what he did in every game that he was healthy. I mean, that's just what Jaden Thomas does. You know, actually, I'm gonna do that math here real quick, Trevor, because I want to make this point. Like, you knew that's who Jaden Thomas was. So let's see here. He had, that's 12 catches there, 16 catches divided by 5 games equals times 13. So that's 42 catches. His yards, so he had 188 yards plus 59 yards. You divide that by 5 equals times 13. So he would have had 42 catches for 642 yards last year if he would have just kept the production he had when he was healthy. And that includes being completely shut out against NC State. Right? Like, that's who Jaden Thomas is. But there was always the if he can stay healthy. We talked about if Deion Coles, he can say, Deion looked pretty good in the opener against Navy. And then he was never healthy again. And he got into Chancey Stuckey's doghouse, which is actually a place I'd rather be. Knowing how he was, I'm actually kind of feel I probably did something right if I'm in Chancey Stuckey's doghouse. But there was always these ifs. If. With this group, the if is simply if Chris Mitchell is exactly who he was at FIU. If Bo Collins is only what he was at Clemson. If Jaden Greathouse is just, if he is just the same guy he was last year. These ifs are more determined. Every team has ifs. I mean, you could say, well, yeah, Ohio State's going to be good if all the guys that were really good last year play as good as they were, this year. Well, sure, everybody's got those ifs. I mean, you think Denzel Burke is going to play as well as he did last year. You think Caleb Williams, they got to prove it, but they're established. You kind of assume that's going to be the case. Notre Dame has over 900 yards receiving coming back from last year on its current roster. They had over 2,000 receiving yards transfer in. That's what it boils down to. Far more established group. Far more diverse group, and a group with a lot more speed. Somebody, and John A1, one of our best posters, kind of said, okay, well, look, if you look at it position by position, you say, okay, well, Chris Tyree's faster than Jaden Greathouse, right? And I forget what the other one he said. This guy's faster than that guy. But I'm like, you look at it and you say, Tobias Merriweather's faster than Bo Collins. That's what he said. Well, I'm like, well, first of all, Tobias is not playing that position. Tobias is playing where Chris Mitchell plays, and he's not faster than Chris Mitchell. Yes, Chris Tyree is faster than Jaden Greathouse. But here's the way I look at it. You look at the top 5 speed guys. Chris Mitchell, Jaden Harrison, KK Smith, Cam Williams, and who was the 5th guy that I brought up? I can't remember who the 5th guy was. Jordan Faison. I said, you take those 5 and you compare those to the top 5 speed guys last year, and it's not even close. It's the overall level of speed that they bring to the table. It's not even close. This receiving core now to where it's not even close. Now they got to prove this and that, and I get all that, but it's not close. The receiving core is significantly better and proven right now than it was a year ago at this time, and then with how it played out. I think that's an easy one.
Yeah, absolutely. The ifs have nothing to do with their ability to play football, which is great. I mean, it's, if they can, to your point, if they can perform like we know that they can, like we've seen before. But in previous years, it's, if Tobias can adjust to playing at the big time level, if Chris Tyree can make the transition from running back to wide receiver. A lot of it was based on their ability to play the position, and that's been eliminated this year in this receiving room. There's always going to be what ifs, sure. But that's what's the most promising. And then you combine that with the speed. Yeah, we're cooking.
Last year, if Jaden Thomas was healthy, they're pretty good there. If not, they're in trouble.
Yeah.
This year, if Jaden Thomas is not healthy, that's fine. You got Bo Collins, you've got Deion Colsey, you've got Micah Gilbert, you could move Cam Williams over there. I mean, you could move Jordan Faison. They've done a lot of different things with that position. So that's another difference. If Jaden Greathouse gets injured and can't play in the slot, you've got Jordan Faison, you've got Jaden Harrison. That's a big difference between this year and last year is if such and such doesn't happen, you're still fine.
Yep.
And last year, if this doesn't happen, you were in trouble. If Jaden Thomas goes down again, it messed up your whole room. If Tobias Merriweather doesn't break out, it messes up your whole room. And when those things happen, that receiving core was doomed. this group is not going to be as doomed. Let's move on over to tight end. It's basically the same guys they had last year, except now you've added Kevin Bauman. We'll see if he can be healthy, and you've added Jack Larson. But there's some guys that are coming off some injuries. So there's a lot of different ways to look at this. So let's just dive right in, Trevor. What say you about the tight end room compared to where it was based on how last season played out?
I would say, for me, my opinion is it's the same, for the simple fact of you have the same people coming back. I would err on the side of it is better because we finally got to see what Mitchell Evans is like when he can be a premier guy. But unfortunately, in comparison to last year, he's coming off of an injury. Eli Raridan, same thing. I like Cooper Flanagan. He is one of those guys that is kind of raising the floor of the room because he has another year under his belt. But simple answer for me is I'm putting it as the same for right now.
I'm going to push back on one part of that. Mitchell Evans was actually injured last year. The difference was he didn't get injured during the season. He got injured in the spring. So that's kind of the concern though, right? Is can he stay healthy? And it's more of a concern now than it maybe was a concern a year ago, because last year's injury was kind of his first injury, significant injury. Now he's had two. So I think it's fair to say, I think the injury thing is fair to say, even though he was injured going into last season and kind of had to be brought along slowly, which is partly why he got off to a slow start last year. It's because he did miss a big chunk of the offseason like he did this year. We got to find out if he's able to overcome that, Trevor. And I think that's a good point. Is Eli Raridan going to be back to his old form? He missed a chunk of last season. They limited his reps in the spring, to your point. The reason I'm going to say it's better is because I think those things, everything you said is true. But you're now in a position where if Cooper Flanagan has to be called upon now, he's way better prepared to handle that than he was a year ago. You also have Jack Larson now, which you don't want to have to play. Jack Larson, you won a red shirt, but he's in a better position. So, and I also think that Mitchell Evans got that necessary, valuable experience last year that he didn't have. Now, so what I would say is if we're going to talk about where this room is now compared to what it was a year ago, it's definitely better. What you're saying, I believe, is that based on what happened in 2023 and what was proven, that it's a wash. Is that fair to say? If I were to ask you, Trevor, how about compared to where the room is now compared to where it was a year ago at this time? Would your answer be different?
I would say I think I would still lean on more of a wash. Honestly,
really?
Yeah, I would, only because in my mind, the way that I view it is I look at it and see, okay, they've had the proven production. Now the other side of that coin is
they didn't last year going into the season.
Gotcha.
Because Mitchell only had let be more clear, because I don't think I answered the question correctly based on your answer. If we were to look at what would your answer be compared to where the tight end room was a year ago today? So
Gotcha.
Mitchell only has 3 career catches. He's come. Eli has one career catch. Cooper's a true freshman. Not how the season played out. But because my thought is it's a no-brainer compared to where it is now, compared to where it was a year ago before the season started.
Gotcha.
But obviously how the season played out, it ended up being a pretty good room. And I misspoke too. You had Holden Stace a year ago last year, which I forgot about as well to factor into your thing, and you don't have him now. So I did forget about Holden Stace.
Yep, that was my bad. I misunderstood what you meant. Taking it to
it's our first show together, man. We're gonna have a couple bumps in the road. You're good, buddy.
No, I appreciate that. I mean, it's yes, taking it where it was at last year today versus now. I'm taking this tight end room absolutely, for sure. But yeah, that's overarching. If it were taking it from today, a year ago to right now, I'm taking this year's tight end room. All things factored out, I'm kind of calling it a wash. And then seeing, for me, it's a big show me what happens when the season starts. I got to know Mitchell Evans is a proven production, and people nationally recognize him as being one of the top returning tight ends. I just want to be sure before I go out and say this tight end room will for sure be better, that we can overcome the injuries for the 2 main starting guys. But I do agree with your point. If Cooper Flanagan has to be tight end 1, I'm a lot more confident this year than if that was the case last year.
Yeah, because last year your third tight end was Cooper Flanagan because Eli Raridan was out. Eli didn't start playing until almost halfway through the season because he was coming off of his own injury.
Yep.
So, yeah, very fair point. It's going to be interesting to see how this is not about this discussion. This is just a side note. It's going to be interesting to see how the emergence of the receiving core, if it happens, impacts the tight end room. Because if the receiving core is as much improved as you and I think it's going to be, you have to defend this tight end room way different. That doesn't factor into the discussion we just had. It's just more of a general observation of this team and this position, because this has been such a tight end dominant, offense for so long. If the receiving core does provide the playmaking that you and I think it's going to dramatically change how teams starting with really Louisville and beyond defend this football team. It's going to make it a lot harder to defend this football team, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think we'll have to reevaluate how we evaluate the tight end room, right? Like, it's as interesting as it is to say, because this is the first time in such a long time that we've been in a position to say we might have, a very elite receiving room from top to bottom. And we don't have to have, in previous years in 2022, based on injuries and style of play. If Michael Mayer doesn't go off that year, we're just not, the offense won't be able to move the ball.
Screwed.
Yeah.
They're screwed. Yeah.
Yeah. You've had that in previous years. Luckily, I don't even want to know what the outcome would have been at the Ohio State game and what the final score would have been last year if Mitchell Evans doesn't have a game that he has.
He was their offense.
Exactly.
Until the late in that game when they finally started giving the ball to Audric and he started leaning on him.
Yep.
Mitchell was your offense. And the same thing against Duke. That's even more so. Take Mitchell Evans out of the game against Duke and they don't win.
Yep.
They could not cover him. They could not cover him last year. And not just on that final drive. It was from jump. They had no answers for Mitchell Evans. None.
Yeah.
So you are correct.
Yep. It's going to be interesting to see. This would be a fun thing to revisit, how we evaluate it today, what we're going to talk about in December, and say, you know what? Hey, we were spot on with this, and go from there.
We'll start with the areas we're spot on, and then somehow we'll have to stop before we get to the areas where we were wrong. We'll just go ahead and leave that part of it out and just focus where we were right. So let's wrap up with the offensive line, because I think this is the concerning area for me. And I'll start off with. I don't think in good faith that we could sit here and say that an offensive line that doesn't have Joe Alt is better than an offensive line that does have Joe Alt today. Based on, even with all the issues that the O-line had last year, there's way too little experience for me. Even if they start Coogan or Spindler, even if they start Tosh, and you're talking about two established tackles, an established center, and two junior guards compared to a lineup that could potentially have, 3 redshirt sophomores, a redshirt freshman, and a true freshman starting lineup. Could it end up being better? I think actually it could. If everything goes right, I think they're going to be way better inside than they were last year. Way better. So if I were to break it into 2 groups, remember how they used to have center guard coaches and then tackle tight end coaches? If we were to do it like that, I think they're going to be better on the inside. Because I wrote an article today, Trevor, and I made this statement. If Notre Dame wanted to, they could have a team with far more experience. A team with over 50 career starts starting against A&M. They could have brought back Zeke Correll and his 20-some plus starts. They could just say, hey, we're going to go with Rocco and Pat Coogan again, and we're going to be a very veteran team, and we're going to start Tosh at left tackle and 5th-year senior, 6-year senior, and then, whoever's at right tackle, right? But they chose to tell Zeke, we love you, thanks, but we're moving on, because the less experienced but more talented player had proven to be, in their opinion, a better option. They don't have Rocco Spindler starting as a second-year player at right guard because Billy Schrouth beat him out. They didn't have Tosh Baker as a 5th-year senior at right tackle because Emil beat him out. And so I think the potential is better as a whole. No one's going to sniff Joe Alt as a player. But the potential as a whole is better than it was last year. But right now, today, when we don't even know who the starting 5 is going to be, the only way I could tell you that it's better is if I was just like, you know what, bro, I'm going full homer today. I'm taking off these glasses. I'm going to go get some green ones that say ND on them, and we're going to say the O-line's better. That's the only way you could say it. Now, optimistically, if happens, it could be better. But we just got done talking about how well that worked out for us when we had that conversation about the receiving core last year. You never want to go in with ifs, and especially on the offensive line. And for me, that's why it's just the O-line going into last year was better.
Yep. Yeah, I agree. I'm on the same page as you. I do think it is a more interesting conversation than what some people might think that it would be. Because again, you look at, well, we lose Blake Fisher and Joe Alt. Of course, the O-line's not going to be as good. You break it down, to your point, I looked at it the same way. The interior of the O-line, I think, is going to be better. And I judge good offensive lines by consistency, right? Which is why I think that a guy in Emil Wagner could live up to playing and filling that void of Blake Fisher, because for as good as Blake Fisher was against Ohio State, it was just, you kind of had to ride the wave with him 100%. And so if you would ask me at the end of the season, who would I rather have, Blake Fisher or Emil Wagner? If Wagner's the more consistent player, I'm taking Emil Wagner. The biggest question is around what happens on the left side of the offensive line. And that to me was more of the deciding factor of who I would take. I don't want to center this around Joe Alt, but again, we don't even know who the 5 are going to be. I'm very confident and I know who 2 of them are, but outside of that, we're going to kind of have to see what happens ideally sometime in the next week. Because I don't want to be having this, here in Marcus Freeman's press conference next Monday and it's game week. And the answer is we are going to put the best 5 out there and we'll let you know when we know.
I'm okay with that answer as long as they know what the answer is. Like, I'm okay with him telling, right? And I get, that's what you were saying. I get what you were saying. You were being realistic, like practical. Like, if that answers the truth,
yeah.
right, then it's a concern.
Yeah.
We'll probably get that answer, but it won't matter if it's more about, okay, but like my hope is that when they go to the practice field yesterday, today, that they've got their starting 5, at least what they think it's going to be established. Now, if somebody outplays somebody for the next week, okay, cool, you make that change, but we're going to want them to have as much time as possible.
Yep.
Looking at, that offensive line as much possible to come together. And the coaching staff is certainly going to need that to be the case. So right now, definitely not better. It definitely has a chance to be better as a whole. There's no question. Now let's wrap this segment up by looking at it from the standpoint of the offense as a whole. Well, actually, you know what? Let's do it this way. Coaching staff. I'm going to throw a little curveball at you that we didn't think about. Coaching staff. Is this coaching staff better now than it was a year ago? I think that answer is obvious.
Yes. Yeah. I am very hard leaning on the side of yes.
Like, yes, this might be the biggest difference. And I liked Jared Parker more than most. I think he was a smart guy, had potential to be even better. Notre Dame did set an all-time scoring record last year, but it's the big games where his inexperience shined. And Mike Denbrock has that. So he's better. And I'm not saying this is like Jared Parker sucked. Like, well, okay, how did he suck when they set a scoring record and scored had more games of 40 points than any time in school history? He just wasn't there. He wasn't ready to shine in the biggest moments. That's what hurt Coach Parker. Now, maybe he got better this year. Maybe. But that's just, it's just not. Mike Denbrock's a far more proven coach. Mike Brown's a better coach than Chancey Stuckey. Not even close, in my opinion. And then now Gino, Dealin, or Gino and Joe Rudolph are going into year 2 now, as opposed to year 1. And Dealin McCullough is one of the best in the business, and he's not going to get worse the longer he's in Notre Dame. So I think the coach, from a coaching standpoint, is significantly better, and that can't be ignored when we talk about, like, if you don't think Joe Rudolph's a great O-line coach, that's fair. That's fine. He has to prove himself. He's not a great O-line coach right now. But I have a hard time thinking he's going to be worse as a coach. Not the line, but him worse in year 2 than he was in year 1. Now that he's got a year of working with these guys. That rarely happens, where guys actually get worse in year 2. Now, of course, it did happen last year with Notre Dame when Chancey Stuckey was worse in year 2 than he was in year 1. But Chancey Stuckey was a neophyte coach who'd never really been a real coach before. He was a real coach for 1 year at Baylor. Joe Rudolph's been around for a minute. So I have a hard time thinking he's going to be worse in year 2. And the rest of it's just better. So way better. So now let's look at it overall as a whole. Actually, you already said yes, right? You did answers. Yes, it is definitely better.
Yep.
Now, with that being factored in, is the Notre Dame offense in 2024 better right now, in your view, than it was through the 2023 season.
Offense as a whole, including coaching staff, players, everything from 10,000-foot view. Yes. Yeah, I will take this 2024 offense for a laundry list of reasons. I mean, one, I like the potential at quarterback more. I was one of those guys where I was excited that we got Sam Hartman last year, but looking at it schematically, I knew there were going to be some bumps and bruises with his adjustments, starting with him having to learn to take snaps under center when he came to South Bend. That to me was an indicator of, okay, this isn't just going to be as simple as let's plug and play here. I like our offensive coordinator. I mean, really the captain of the offense and kind of pointing it in the direction it needs to. I'm with you. I was not a Jared Parker hater last year. He learned in his first year as an offensive coordinator that unfortunately at Notre Dame, yeah, you have 12 games, you get measured by 4 of them. And
that's how it should be at Notre Dame. I'm not saying, oh, it's unfair to, no, it's unfair to the harshness in which he's critiqued by some is unfair. The point that they're making in their criticism is not unfair. No, he did not do a good enough job in those big games. But though he was over his head, he's a bum. That's nonsense.
Agreed.
Right? But this is Notre Dame. You're judged by what you do on the biggest stages, and that's how it should always be.
Yeah, absolutely. Marcus Freeman learned it in 2022. You know, unfortunately, I hate to bring up the Marshall game, but he learned the hard way that whenever anybody comes to play you, whether it be a neutral site in South Bend, at their house, it's their Super Bowl. And he learned that the hard way. And so then fast forward to last year, what happened? The teams that we should have beat by 21 points or more, we did, right? I think getting back to which team I would take, I'm taking this year's quarterback. Overall as an offense, I'm taking just the ceiling's higher. There's significantly less what-if questions. There are more around the offensive line, but I've heard you guys talk about it in other shows. The offensive line doesn't have to play at a Joe Moore Award level winning championship offensive line for us to compete for a national championship this year. They just have to be good. Yep. And I think they have the potential to do that. So I'm taking the 2024 offense.
I am as well, and it's not really close. I mean, you're better on coaching is better, more experienced, more big game experience. You're better at quarterback. You're deeper at quarterback. You're at least deeper and more explosive at running back. You may not be better, but you're more dynamic. You're more dynamic. You're deeper. You're more experienced. You're more proven at receiver. At the very least, tight end's a wash. If I forced you, Trevor, to say one is better or one is worse at tight end, I'd be curious what your answer would be. Like, you can't just go wash. But it is close, so it's not going to be worse, I don't think, than last year. And then offensive line, same thing. Does it have a Joe Walt in it? No, it doesn't. Is it going to be as good in game one as they were against Ohio State last year? Highly unlikely. Can they get better during the season? Sure. I mean, so while the offensive line could end up being the kryptonite to this team is in regard to winning a championship, that is flat out true. I still think this offense is better than it was a year ago. I don't know if it's a championship caliber unit yet. The offensive line is going to determine that ultimately. But it's certainly better than it was last year. I'd feel a whole lot better going to play Ohio State with this group of players and coaches than I did last year. And
yeah,
that's a no doubt. That's a no-brainer. Like, I would have far more confidence that the Clemson game is going to be completely flipped with this group than what we had last year. From what we saw from Notre Dame last year heading into that game and how that game played out.
Sure. The only way that I'm taking facets of the offense in 2023 is if we get as granular to say, I'm taking this left tackle, I am taking this number 2, insert whatever. That is where I would draw my differences. But a unit as a whole, I mean, I'm probably looking at it to start this year. Running back is still tough because it depends on the scheme you're in. I'm taking this year's receiving core, this year's quarterback. Tight ends, I would take this year for the sole fact that the floor is being raised. But yeah, it'd have to be really granular for me to pick something in.
You just said something really interesting that I didn't think about to do the show is, what would your all Notre Dame starting lineup be if you could take last year's group or this year's group? I'm going 24 Riley Leonard at quarterback,
okay,
23 Audric at running back.
Mm-hmm.
if I could say which depth chart would I want, I'd probably go with this year's, but I'm just talking starting lineup. My receiving core would be Chris Mitchell, Jaden Greathouse, and probably Bo Collins or 24 version of Jaden Thomas.
Mm-hmm.
My tight end would be 24 version of Mitchell Evans because he's more experienced. He gained experience from last year. My left tackle is Anthony Knapp. Totally kidding. Joe Alt. My left guard would be whoever starts at left guard this year, whether it's Pat Coogan, Rocco Spindler, or Sam Pendleton or Sullivan Absher, because whoever wins that job is going to be better than what Pat Coogan was last year.
Mm-hmm.
Center, I'm going with Ashton Craig. Right guard, I'm going with Billy Schrouth. Right tackle, I'd go with Blake Fisher. Now, I think Emil, to your point, Emil may end up being a better player than Blake, but I know what Blake was, warts and all. I knew what Blake was on his best day. I knew what Blake was on his worst day. I have no clue what Emil is going to be. So I'm going with Emil at right tackle, Blake at right tackle. So I think that's what three starters from last year's team on this year's team. If we just look at the starting lineup, I think that says a lot. Now, to answer Raymond's question from earlier, Raymond, if you want to look at statistics for me, it's with Riley Leonard, it's going to come down to total yards per game and touchdowns. Maybe Riley throws for more. I actually think Riley's going to throw for more yards than Sam did last year but that's not going to be Riley versus Sam. That's going to be more of a byproduct of what was around the two quarterbacks. So I don't think that's really fair. But if to talk about how if Riley's having the impact that we hope, it's about yards per game and touchdowns. That's really what I want out of Riley Leonard. I want him to be over 280 to 290 yards per game minimum of total offense, rushing and passing, and I want him to be averaging about 3 touchdowns a game. That's really where I want him to be. Regular season average of about 2.5 to 3 touchdowns a game. Running back, it's going to come down to yards per carry, yards per touch, rushing and receiving. And then can you match that? The short yardage situations is ultimately going to tell me the difference. If they can figure out a way to match last year's success, and that could include Riley Leonard, then as far as the offense, then I'm going to feel that that's how this running back room is better. Higher yards per touch average. Touch means carries and catches. And then how are they in short yards? That could be second and short, third and short, and then goal to go situations is going to determine ultimately if this room is better. Receiver, it's that's the easiest one, pure production. And then I also want to see more big plays from structure. Some of the big plays that they had in the receiving game last year were off of broken plays. You think of the Chris Tyree play, some things like that. Are they making more big plays from the scope of the offense? So not Riley running to his right, finding a guy coming across the backside for a 50-yard touchdown. I mean, within the structure of the play calls, are they producing more 30-plus yard big plays? That's the one thing I would look at specifically beyond just overall production. What percentage of the receptions are 30-plus yard gains? 25 to 30-plus yard gains. That's going to tell me a lot because compared to last year. And then, of course, O-line is just going to come down to I think you nailed it. There's no statistical thing. It's consistency. And if you want to know how the offensive line performs, what are their yards per carry and what are the sack allowed numbers against A&M, Louisville, Florida State, and USC? That's what it's going to come down to for me. So those are the statistics I would look at for that, Raymond. So before we move on to the defense, folks, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, hit the notification bell, share this podcast, give us a 5-star review. Some great feedback in the chat right now about how well Trevor's doing today. So I appreciate that. And if you have not done so, sign up for the message board at boards.archbreakdown.com. And especially if you're someone who has a positive outlook on the season, we definitely need you to sign up today because there's some cranky people on the message board today that are a little bit nervous about this Texas A&M game. So we need some more of that positivity over there today so we can spruce up the confidence level and the energy on the side a little bit today. I'm being sarcastic, a little sarcastic. But anyway, check that out at boards.archbreakdown.com. All right, so let's go into the final part of today's show, Trevor, and that is going to be the defense. We're going to look at the same exact type of conversation that we had in the offensive show. We're going to go position by position, then we'll talk coaching, then we will talk big picture. How are they going to be? And this one is going to be a lot more debatable for me because last year offense was a disappointing one, in some big moments. This year is like, okay, which excellent group will be better? And that's kind of how I look at it from the defenses. So this one's going to take on a little bit of a different tone, but let's start with the position players, or the players, and by position, and start with the defensive line. It always starts with the big boys, right? Like, you lose Javonte Jean-Baptiste, you lose Nana Osafo-Mensah from last year's rotation. I believe that's the only guys that you lost from last year, correct? Yes. You add RJ Oben, you add Bryce Young, and then now you've got some young players kind of stepping in the mix that weren't necessarily there last year. So let's begin with the defensive line. Trevor, which unit right now is Notre Dame better on the D-line right now than when they were with how last season, based on how last season played out?
Yeah, I'm taking this season's D-line. First and foremost, I think that from everything that I've heard and just through natural player progression, I think that this D-line unit is deeper. Going into last year, I loved what Javonte Jean-Baptiste turned into. But if I'm being 100% honest, I didn't know that he was capable of having that kind of season because he was very much a rotational guy at Ohio State. I look at that and I say, well, we're replacing his production with RJ Oben's, and RJ Oben was a proven producer at Duke. Call the defensive tackles a wash. I would even err on the side of they're better because they are just a year more into this system, a year more into being those dudes on the D-line. Then you compound that with the young talent that they got with Bryce Young and, another year of development for Botello and Josh Burnham and some of those guys. I'm taking this year's D-line.
Yeah, I think that's you can maybe debate it, but I don't think there's much of a debate because, as you mentioned, you have everybody coming back, and what you've added is more dynamic than what you had last year. Now, will RJ Oben match his production that you had? Like that? That's the biggest question. I mean, you had 16 tackles for loss and 8 sacks from last year's big end position. Can they match that or not? I don't know, but I don't think they necessarily have to. I expect Viper to be better this year, not just because Jordan Botelho comes back. Junior Tuamaka is a year older in the system. I think he'll be better than he was last year. How much better? I don't know, but I think he'll be better. But I think the presence of Boubacar Traore at the very minimum is going to be a situational pass rusher that they did not have last year. And then you look at the other position, and even if RJ is just a wash with Javonte, I think the combination of Josh Burnham and Bryce Young as the number 2 and 3 is and I love Nana. I think Nana was such a valuable rotation player last year, but Josh Burnham and Bryce Young are just going to be more dynamic and just better. And it's certainly in the pass game. So I think then you've got Riley Mills coming back. You've got Howard Cross coming back. Jason Onye now has a year under his belt in the rotation. Donovan Heinisch is now a junior as opposed to, obviously being a sophomore last year. He's going to be older, stronger, experienced. You add Armel Mukum, who has really taken advantage of Gabriel Rubio coming back. And Gabriel Rubio's injury sucks for right now. It's going to suck for September potentially, but it's going to end up, I think, being a blessing in disguise when he comes back, whether it's October, November, because you're going to add a 300-plus pound fresh guy to your defensive line for that stretch run. And I think that can end up, not that I wanted it to happen, but hey, if it did happen, and so here's the benefit that could come from that. So I think it's going to be better. And I think the where it's going to show itself as better is potentially as pass rushers, but I really think it's going to come down to the run game. I think this D-line is going to be more impactful with negatives, tackles for loss, getting penetration, making some of those plays this year than it was last year. I think that's really where you're going to see the biggest difference, because I think this is going to be a stronger group, a bigger group than it was a year ago, and a deeper group, a much deeper group than it was a year ago. From an experience, I mean, you had some of the same guys. You had Jason Onye last year and Donovan Heinisch last year. What's the difference? Well, Jason Onye had never played a meaningful down in his life until before last year. Donovan Heinisch had never played a meaningful down of his life. And I mean, talking about college prior to last year. Now those guys have played a couple hundred snaps. And so they're more experienced. Now Armel Mukum is your number 4, 5 guy is the one with no experience. Where last year it was like your 3, your 4, and your 5. And so it's a much different scenario. Josh Burnham was really going into his first year in the rotation last year. He's now got a year under his belt. Junior was going to his first year as in the rotation under his belt. Now he's more experienced. Boubacar was a true freshman last year. Armel was a true freshman last year. Now they're sophomores. So I just think overall there's a lot more depth, a lot more size, and a lot more playmaking ability up front than there was a year ago. And that's why I think this line is the pick as well. Let's go linebacker, because this one to me is the one I had the hardest time with. There's different ways to look at it. I'll just speak for the both of us, and you correct me if I'm speaking improperly. There's no debate which room is more talented. It's this one. This one has more God-given athletic ability than last year's, because you lose you lose Maris Leofau and J.D. Bertrand, but you add older versions of Drake Bowen and Preston Zinner and Jaden Ausberry, plus you add Kingston to the mix. Like, to me, athletically, there's no discussion. Athletically doesn't equal better production, better football play. That's the debate. So you lose two-time captain, 3-year starter J.D. Bertrand. You lose 2-year starter Maris Leofau, who's really been in the rotation since 2020, missed 2021 with an injury. JD was a 5th-round pick. Maris was a 3rd-round pick. You're really replacing all 3 starters from your linebacking core last year, Trevor, when you consider that Jack Kaiser was your starting rover. He's now at will. So you're also having to replace your starting rover from last year. Even though that guy returns, he's not returning at rover. Sure. So really your linebacking core is going to look completely different this season. Will it be better? Will it be better overall? Will it be better early, late? You can take it however you want. Will the linebacking core be better this year than it was last year?
I think it will be for their length and their athleticism. It's so tough to replace the leadership that J.D. Bertrand left out, right? And that's shoes that kind of tandem Jack Kaiser and Drake Bowen are going to have to fill. Max Bulla, the linebacker coach, has been very vocal that they are going to play a 5-rotation linebacking core, which I love that move. But it's tough to say which one I would take more, because you're having to play essentially 5 guys to replace the value of those core 3 that you lost, in my eyes. But I think at the end of the day, when we're sitting here in December, which room do I think is going to be better? I do think it's going to be the 24 room, because they are longer, they are faster. I mean, just on paper, they're bigger, right? I mean, J.D. Bertrand was, great player. I think he was 6'1" with cleats and a helmet on, and you have Drake Bowen, who is all of 6'2", 6'3". You have Kingston Viliama-Asa, who is all of 6'3", and he's young. So I think with the depth of this year and with the overall ceiling of the talent, I'm going to give it to this class of linebackers this year. The only thing that I'm missing out on is the leadership, which I do think, whether it be from other position groups or up and coming new guys in this room, I think you're still getting, but just not from JD.
I feel a lot of this position a lot like I did at running back. I'm back and forth. I believe I said in the chat or in the post on the message board, I believe I said linebacker, and then I've kind of been back and forth. And really, honestly, I'm having a hard time picking one even now. I'm going to go with 2024 simply because my personal bias, and I'll be honest, is I tend to value the talent over the experience, even at a place like linebacker. I always, if it's close, yeah, you may lean towards the experience, but sometimes I think overall depth, I don't think it's all that close. I think last year's J.D. Bertrand is one of the most underappreciated and underrated linebackers Notre Dame has ever had. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of fans that have convinced themselves that he's a slightly more athletic version of Joe Schmidt. And the NFL is trying to tell you, guys, he's not. He's an NFL football player. That's why he was drafted in the 5th round of the NFL draft. J.D. was an athletic player. He had good power for his size. The only thing he lacked was size and length. He has short arms. He's not a real big guy, but he's a very good football player at Notre Dame. He was your leading tackler for 3 straight years, and he was wicked smart and a great leader. But part of the reason I'm optimistic that this groom is going to be better is because he was a great leader. Because from what I was told from various sources, he took Drake Bowen under his wing the entire season and was like, okay, I'm going to teach you what it's like to be a pro at this level so you can come and be my replacement next year. And I've talked a lot about that this summer. That means Drake's going to be ahead of the game from where he would have been on just normal development. That's huge in football to have that veteran leadership. But I think the reason I think it's going to be better is twofold. I don't think Drake is going to be as consistently effective as JD. But I think Drake is going to make more big plays than JD. He's going to make more mistakes than JD, but he's going to make more big plays. But I think they're going to be improved everywhere else. I think the will position is going to be better. Maris was an impactful player for Notre Dame last year, but he was very inconsistent when it came to his execution. They're going to be more consistent there this year. So you're going to lose a little bit at Mike, but I think you're going to gain it at Will. So that right there makes the whole effectiveness and assignment correctness a wash. Once you take that out of the mix, then I don't think it's really that much of a debate in my view because of the overall talent. You're getting Jalen Sneed. We had Jalen Sneed last year, yes, but now you get junior year version of Jalen Sneed who played a couple hundred snaps last year. He's going to be better than he was last year. Drake Bowen, as good as I think he'll be as a sophomore, I do think Kingston was better than him as a freshman. Now, that doesn't impact this year because Drake's always going to be your head of Kingston. But if I'm going to say who's better, Drake or Kingston, as true freshmen comparing 23 to 24, I think I shouldn't say better. He's more ready to play the day one than Drake was, partly because of the program he came from. This is a kid that has played on national television at St. John Bosco. He's played against elite level talent where Drake was always. I don't know that there was ever a high school football game that Drake Bowen played in where he wasn't the best player on the field. Kingston can't always say that because of him. He had to play against Modern Day and some great programs. And so I think he's more ready to play day one than Drake was a year ago. Even though I think right now Drake's ahead of Kingston right now, that's what I believe to be true. And I actually think the future of linebacker is not one or the other. Mike, I think they're both going to start eventually. And then at Rover, you don't have the experience of Jack Kaiser, but you're deeper now. And you've got Jalen Sneed, obviously can play that position, and then Jaden Alsbury can play that position. So, and then of course they didn't use the Rover a ton last year. I mean, Jack Kaiser had about 100 fewer snaps than Thomas Harper, and when you start throwing Clarence Lewis's nickel snaps in there, he was like 150 to 200 snaps beneath what the nickel was last year. So I think you're going to be deeper. I think you're going to be more athletic. I think they're going to make more big plays, and I think this linebacking room is going to be even better getting after the quarterback. That's a pure projection. But when I look at the size and the athleticism that they're going to be throwing from the inside with Drake and Kingston and Jack Kaiser and Jalen Sneed, I think this linebacking core is going to be really impactful rushing the quarterback. And that's going to factor into it as well. So, yes, we'll see more mistakes. Yes, we'll probably see more 20-plus yard runs allowed this year compared to last year. But I think we're going to see a lot more plays than we saw last year for a host of reasons, including the defensive line is going to be even more impactful. And that makes the linebackers more impactful. So it's not by a lot, but I do think that's the reason I go with the 24 group over the 23 group is that right there. So, Trevor, we're going to look at the secondary a little bit differently. We're going to first look at it separately. So the two outside corners at one, and then we'll look at the two safeties and the nickel in part two. And then we'll also evaluate it as a whole. So let's first begin at corner. Lose Cam Hart, lose Clarence Lewis, Christian Gray, Jaden Mickey become more prominent players. You add Leonard Moore to the mix. Cornerback, Benjamin Morrison's now a junior, sophomore last year. Cornerback, what say you? Is Notre Dame better in 2024 based on where we are right now compared to where they were last season?
This one was a tough one for me because of the loss of Cam Hart. If I'm looking at the cornerback room as a whole, I do still like the 2024 room. For one, Ben Morrison, like a lot of other players, is a year older. I mean, it's weird. It feels just like yesterday that it was 2022 and he was the young guy that was making all the plays, and now he's the guy, right? He's a year older. He has more experience. Christian Gray has all of the potential in the world. I mean, I've heard you mention it on other shows, but I also, when I watch them live, I do get confused a lot of who is who. Play styles are very similar. I love the young talent that they added. Leonard Moore, his length, his size is going to be great. And of course, Jaden Mickey. You know, I love Jaden Mickey. He's a very aggressive corner, which I like. Not afraid of physical contact. I like where this room is at. I I think, again, I kind of evaluate the room as a whole of where their ceiling is at and where their floor was. And I think the middle kind of takes care of itself. And I think that the cornerback room this year has a higher floor than where it was at last year.
I agree with the last part that you said the ceiling is higher, correct? Is what you said?
Mm-hmm.
I agree with that. Right now, I'm taking last year's corner room right now, simply because the way I look at it is the additional experience for Christian Gray and Jaden Mickey doesn't overcome losing Cam right now. I do agree with you, however, there's a chance it could be better. And I won't be shocked if it is, but there's a lot more I need to see it, because I think Cam Hart was special last year.
Yeah.
Now, do I think if Christian Gray is as good as I think he's going to be, that they're going to be better? Yeah, I do. And I also think Benjamin Morrison is going to be better than he was a year ago also. So the potential's there. I don't really disagree with your overall take. I just can't pull the trigger on it being better because of Cam Hart until I see Christian Gray go be what I think he can be.
Sure.
And that I see that Jaden Mickey has kind of figured out his role and bought into it. And I also want to see if, can Leonard Moore help out a little bit? So it's not huge, because I do think you're more, but last year you had Benjamin Morrison, Cam Hart, Jaden Mickey, and Christian Gray. Well, now you've only got 3 of those 4 guys. So, I mean, if you want to just look player for player, you lost Cam Hart and you replaced him with Leonard Moore. Well, right now, that's a big drop-off. I think Leonard Moore eventually is going to be really good. I've been high on the Leonard Moore train since they landed him the summer before last. But Leonard Moore in 2024 is not in the same league as Cam Hart was in 2023.
Sure.
Now, the question is going to be, the end result is, does the experience that Christian Gray and Jaden Mickey and Benjamin Morrison all gained trump that? That's where it could end up being better. But as of right now, today, August 20th, I've tried to talk myself into it, and I just can't. I just can't. So I'm going with the cornerback room. Safety, completely different story for me, Trevor. You bring back Xavier Watts. He now has a full 2 years of experience under his belt as a safety. You trade DJ Brown for Rod Hurd, big upgrade. You trade Adon Schuler for Ramon Henderson, pretty significant upgrade for me. And I think Thomas Harper is a more dynamic player than Jordan Clark. I think Jordan Clark will be a little bit more steady player. So it's pretty even there. Even if you were to say Thomas Harper was better, the overall safety position is, to me, this is the spot on defense where Notre Dame has made by far the biggest jump. Like, I think linebacker is going to be a little bit better. I think D-line's going to be a little bit better. I think corner's just not quite as good, could maybe be a little bit better. Safety, for me, is a position where I think they're going to be significantly better than they were. I love DJ Brown. Great kid, leader, smart, but he just was limited athletically.
Yeah.
Rod Hurd, I think, is a more dynamic player. Ramon Henderson was a really good athlete, just was not a football player. He just was not an instinctive football player. Adon Schuler's the complete opposite. So I think safety is a position where they're going to be a lot better. A lot better.
Yeah, I am 100% on the same page as you. I mean, breaking it down player by player, call Xavier Watts, I guess, a wash if you want to, but he's gotten better, right? So at the minimum, I think you say, well, last year had Xavier Watts. This year they have Xavier Watts. Love Adon Schuler's athletic ability. Couple that with he's a really smart football player, man. I mean, his IQ for the game is there. And then, yes, losing some of the players to the transfer portal and graduation. They're without DJ Brown and Ramon Henderson. There's been a lot of talk about who's going to replace the production of Thomas Harper, since a fair share of players got that kind of like that slot corner nickel playing time reps last year. But I mean, Rod Hurd and Jordan Clark coming into the mix, they are very experienced football players. I mean, between the two of them, they have 4,126 snaps of football under their belt coming into this year. And I think that that's one thing that people kind of forget about is we're replacing an experienced player with more experienced players. Similar to the wide receiver room, we're kind of eliminating the what ifs. They're not able to play the position. We know that they can play football. It's more of the conversation of, are they going to be who we think that they're going to be? And luckily for us, we can go back at the film with Rod Hurd and we can confidently say, yeah, I think that he can. So I think that the safety room this year is going to be significantly better than where it was at last year. And the safety room last year had I forgot the name of the award because it's hard to keep track of all of them, but the award that Xavier Watts won, it's returning that, and it has gotten better.
I think the Rod Hurd's a guy that came out of the Big Ten with over 80 tackles last year. This is a kid that's got over 2,000 career snaps in the Big Ten. Yep. He's just a better player. Now, there was a concern I had. My answer would not have been emphatic it was better. I've been saying it all summer. You've heard me say that plenty of times. I'm more emphatic now that I've actually seen with my own eyes what Rod Hurd looks like in this defense and what Jordan Clark looks like in this defense, and then just Don Schuler's maturation as a player. Right? Like I felt good about Xavier's going to be a wash at the very least, right? I mean, interceptions may go down, overall play is going to go up. I mean, that's kind of how I look at it. I fully felt that Adon was an upgrade over Ramon Henderson. The question is going to be, how does Rod Hurd make the transition from nickel at Northwestern to safety at Notre Dame? That was the only potential hang-up. Now that I've seen it, all right, they're better, and they're significantly better, in my opinion. And now that's why, and when I look at the secondary as a whole, I think they're going to be better. And I think they're better now than they were last year, because even though corner's not quite as good, we're talking about them having still a top 5 corner room last year and still a top 5 cornerback room this year. It's just by a small percentage, maybe just not as good at some things. Like, I think they'll be better at coverage this year than they were last year with Cam. But Cam was a playmaker that kind of shut down half the field. I mean, he's like, 3 forced fumbles and, great against perimeter runs and perimeter screens and things like that. I mean, think about the first half against Clemson. Every time they kept trying to run those bubble screens and now screens against Cam, and he kept blowing it up in 2022. They didn't try a whole lot of those in 2023, right. And they definitely didn't try any to the field where Cam was. And so slightly maybe not as good, but safety is way better than maybe the cornerback room is. Now, obviously for you, Trevor, the answer is easy because you said they're better at both positions. So obviously the secondary as a whole, you think they're going to be better. For me, I think the secondary is going to be better because of the fact that as a whole, I just think they're deeper. They're going to be better at coverage. Yeah. And they're just overall more athletic. Christian Gray is every bit the athlete Cam Hart was, and he's faster. But Rod Hurd is a much better athlete, in my opinion, than what DJ Brown was. And so overall, I just think this is a deeper group, a more veteran group. I mean, think about it. You have 4 captains in the secondary. Think about that, Trevor. 4 captains. Because Benjamin Morrison and Xavier Watts are captains now. Jordan Clark was a captain at Arizona State last year, and Rod Hurd was a captain at Northwestern last year. You had 4 players that have been college captains in your secondary. Yeah. Right? So what's the biggest loss that I had with losing Cam Hart? Leadership. That's a position where he was a great leader, but you're going to be okay there because not only do you have Xavier and Benjamin, but you added 2 Power 5 captains to your secondary in the portal. Not worried about leadership at all. If the cornerback room can be better than it was last year, and you're correct there, they may have one of the 2 best secondaries in all of college football, if not the best. But at the very least, they're top 5 easy, in my opinion, right now, because they're that much better at safety compared to last year, and corner is slightly one. Like, I don't think you're saying they're way better at corner than they were last year, and I'm not saying they're going to be way worse at corner. It's similar. If I have to lean one way or the other, I'd probably go here. Yep. But safety much better, which means overall secondary better. Yep. Let's talk coaching. You lose Chris O'Leary. You replace him basically with Marty Biaggi. I mean, that's because you had Max Bullough as your linebackers coach last year. So Max is technically a full-time assistant now. But Max's role as a football coach doesn't change a ton from last year. I mean, he's got a little bit more authority in that room, but he was your linebackers coach last year. Chris O'Leary was your safeties coach. Now Mike Mickens is the entire safeties coach, secondary coach, and Marty Biaggi and some analysts and GAs are now helping at safety. Al Golden goes into year 3. Al Washington goes into year 3. Mike Mickens goes into year 5, and Marty Biaggi goes into year 2. first year working with the defense. Max Bullock's going into year 2. But you lost Chris O'Leary, who I believe was a very good safeties coach. Take recruiting out of the equation. Just as a football coach, he's a very good football coach, which is why Jim Harbaugh hired him. Because Jim Harbaugh likes football coach, like good football. He didn't care about recruiting in the NFL. Can you coach football? And there's no doubt that Chris O'Leary can coach football. So, coaching-wise, is Notre Dame better, the same, or slightly worse than what they were last season?
I'm going to call them the same if I'm comparing it like from where we're at today to where we were at last year. Losing Chris O'Leary is tough because, to your point, he is just a football guy. He knows ball, great coach. I mean, we saw what he did with Xavier Watts as a safety coach, right? Like he knows what he's doing, okay? But then on the flip side of the coin, you have everybody is a year older. This is Al Golden's 3rd year with Notre Dame. This is Al Washington's 3rd, right? He
came in with Freeman's first year. So
that's right.
Him and Golden both came in as part of Freeman's first staff. So 2022, yeah.
Okay. So, we have Washington going into year 3. We have Max Bullough another year under his belt, and I've loved everything that I've heard about him. I'm very excited. He's one of the main reasons why I'm excited to see what this linebacking core does this year, because of how he is as a coach and how he basically what he demands of his players in a good light. And you combine that with their athleticism, I think it's going to be really exciting. Mike Mickens being the defensive passing game coordinator, and it's his 5th year in South Bend. I don't want to weigh, losing one coach being as detrimental, but I think it could have an effect. I think they kind of put the Band-Aid on the bullet hole is making Mike Mickens the overall kind of ringleader and passing game defense, right? But I think as of right now, if I were to take it today, I think it's the same. But I think that overall as a coaching staff, as this year progresses, at the end of the year, I think I'm taking the 24 coaching staff.
Same. I've had to kind of talk my way through it a little bit, but same way you did. I think Mike Mickens is just one of the best in the business, and I think he'll be able to handle this. I think one thing that's going to help too is this new rule that analysts can now be on the field. Yeah, that gives Notre Dame extra bodies to be down there working with those guys. Al Golden going into year 3, I think help. I mean, the more time these kids are in his system, the better they're going to be. And then Al Washington. The big question for me is, who is Al Washington? Is he the guy that we saw in 2022 where the D-line never quite lived up to the hype, to the talent that it had? Or is it like 2023 where I felt like he got everything out of what that line could be last year for the most part? I think Jordan Patel was a little disappointing, but I don't put that on him. I think Jordan Patel put on too much weight and just didn't play the way that he's capable of. I don't blame him. I've always said this, when you look at a position coach and there's a player at a position that's struggling, that's usually I kind of put that on the player more often than not. When it's a coaching problem is when it's happening kind of with several guys. And when everybody else played really well and got better, except for Jordan Patel, I kind of put that more on Jordan, but I tend to think that Al Washington is what we saw last year is more of who he is as a position coach. So I think that's obviously now he's going into year 3. I think it'll be even better. So I think I give a slight edge to it because of the fact that you retained everybody else and you now have more people that can help Mike Mickens, whereas with the old rules, maybe Mike Mickens doesn't have as much help. And when I mean help, I mean he literally can't be at 2 places at once.
Sure.
He can't be coaching the safeties during individual drills and the corners because they don't do the same drills, nor should they do the same drills.
Right.
So do you have someone that can do that? You've got to have multiple sets of eyes to really watch a position group like that, which is spread across the entire field. You can see everything, but you can't watch everything as in detail. And so I think that helps him a little bit. So I do think it's slightly better, but I think last year's defensive staff was really good.
Yep.
And the big thing for me is I just don't want to see regression. If they're just as good as last year, that's a win.
Yeah.
I just don't want to see a regression with Chris O'Leary being gone. And I don't think we will. Because I think for what you lose for him as an assistant coach from a technical standpoint, you're going to gain some advantages now that they're all in the same room, speaking the same language, talking to each other. I think that you're going to see whereas O'Leary would tell his guys his thing, Mickens would tell his guys his thing, and then they'd have to kind of go figure it out on the field. Now it's like everybody's leaving the meeting room with one message from one coach.
Yep.
And I think that's going to help overcome the fact that they're not going to have the same position coach during Indy and the technical parts that they had last year. So that's where I'm coming from. So defense as a whole, we thought the offense would be slightly better, so it was going to be better than last year. Now let's look at the defense as a whole. Players, coaching, all of that stuff together. Do you expect the 2024 defense to be better than the 2023 defense?
I do. I think we got longer. I think we got more athletic. And one of the things that not enough people are talking about, I think, is it's been a very active offseason for us. We got Riley Leonard, Mike Denbrock's coming back to Notre Dame. Got these slew of transfer wide receivers coming in. I don't think enough people are talking about that Al Golden is going into year 3. And the jump that he made from year 1 to 2 is fantastic. I'm not saying the gap of progression is going to be as big, but everything is going to be more refined.
We can hope.
Yeah.
Could you imagine if they made if the jump from year 3 was as big as the jump from year 1 to 2? Like,
if that happens, people are going to be talking about one of the best defense, like 2012 defense-esque type of.
Yeah, with 2012 defense with speed, depth.
Yeah.
Right.
Like, yes. If everybody on the 2023 secondary had Kavari Russell speed, that's what we would be talking about. But I think taking all of those factors into account, I'm going to take the 24 team. And I know that this is, doesn't have to be said, but doesn't mean that I think that, the 23 defense wasn't good. Obviously, they were fantastic, right? But I'm similar to you. I will take athleticism and speed and length over the guy that might be physically not all the way there, but a great leader and a great mind. And, you kind of have to take the bumps and bruises with that, which is why I think the game against Texas A&M to start the year is so highlighted. But I think overall, I think we're going to look back and say that this 24 team defense was better. I think it's tough for me to say. I don't want to be the eye test guy because I'm analytical and I dive into stats a lot. But I think in some areas, especially in the big games, you can see, the pass rush is getting after it more this year than it was last year in big games, right? I think worst case scenario, you call the secondary a wash because the secondary played great.
Yeah.
Well,
hold on. You played great. They only ranked 3rd in the nation in pass defense last year, number 1 in passer rating last year, number 2 in completion percentage allowed. And they were only 3rd in fewest yards per attempt allowed. And they only tied Michigan for the fewest touchdown passes allowed. I don't know if that's good or not, but I guess it's okay.
Yeah, it's decent, I suppose. I guess.
Yeah. When you're top 5, like in every category, I'd say that's pretty good.
Twist my arm if we have to have that secondary again, I suppose.
Right. No, but your point is spot on though, right? Like with the defense as a whole, the big thing is just don't regress. Yep. Like if all they are is a wash from last year, Trevor, that's a win. Like, because they were really good last year on defense. Even the Louisville game, you look and say, they lost 38-20. I'm like, they didn't give up 38 points on defense. It was 7-7 at halftime. I don't know what it was 7-7 at halftime, and you forced a fumble and gave your offense the ball in Louisville territory to start the third quarter. Like, you didn't lose that game because your defense. You didn't lose the Ohio State game because of your defense. Yeah, they should have made some plays to win the game at the end, but you shouldn't have put them in that position where 17 points was enough to beat you. The only game where I felt the defense didn't bring it was Clemson. But you know what? That happens to every team every year, right? Notre Dame didn't have the offense to bail them out in that 1 or 2 games a year where they weren't elite. And the best teams do that. Georgia has had those games in 21 and 22 when they won national titles. There were games where their defense wasn't as lights out as it normally is, but their offense bailed them out. You have to be that sometimes. You have to have those games sometimes. And you look at like 2022, for example, Trevor. That Georgia defense was really good all year, but they had to get bailed out by the offense against Ohio State in the semifinal game because they could not stop Trevor or CJ Stroud in that game. There's nothing. They knew what he's going to do, and there's nothing they could do about it. He just was so good that game. Offense had to bail you out. I don't care who you are. That's going to have to happen from time to time. And Notre Dame didn't have that kind of offense last year. So, but to your point, if they improve, then that kind of gets really scary. And here's my question. If the offense is improved, how does that help the defense? Like that's going to be something that's going to be very fascinating to see with how this team plays out this year. So it's good stuff, Trevor. Very good first show, man. I enjoyed that. That was really good stuff. So that's going to do it for today's show, everybody. I appreciate y'all joining us today. Well, actually, you know what, Trevor? Let's actually do one thing before we go. We did not do this. Starting lineup between 23 and 24 team. I'm going to go Viper. I'm going to go 24 version of Jordan Patejo with sophomore version of Boubacar.
Okay.
I'm going to go RJ Oben or Josh Burnham over Javonte Jean-Baptiste.
Okay.
I'm going to go 24 version of the two tackles. I don't see how you can't take the older, stronger, more experienced versions of those players. Linebacker, I'm going to go 24 Jack Kaiser at Will. I'm still going to go at JD at Mike. I just, like that, And then at Rover, I'm going to go with 23 version of Jack Kaiser. Starting lineup. Again, part of the reason I like the linebacking core better this year is the depth.
Yep.
Secondary, 24 Benjamin Morrison, 23 Cam Hart, 23 Thomas Harper. Secondary, Rod Hurd at boundary safety, 24 Xavier Watts at other safety. Now, can I go 23 Xavier Watts at boundary and 24 Xavier Watts at the field? Is that doable? Can we do that? Or
I mean, I don't see why not. They're different players from different years. I mean, right. Who knows?
That'd be very, very nice. Very, very nice if we could see that. So anyway, that's going to do it for today's show, everybody. Reminder, 6:00 tonight is when IB Nation Sports Talk goes live. They had to push the show back a little bit. They'll be back on track tomorrow. I'll be back tomorrow at 1:00, going to have a lot more fun Notre Dame stuff to talk about. Folks, before you get out of here, hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, share this podcast, give us a 5-star review. We greatly appreciate that. Sign up for the message board at boards.irishbreakdown.com. And want to thank you all again so very much. I'm going to get ready to call my wife now. Check, she's headed to the vet with Rita. We've had a little mini update, 2 good days in a row with Rita, and there's actually some light at the end of the tunnel that she might actually pull through this. So we'll know more in the next day or two, and I'll update you guys more when we get that. So definitely going to keep praying and very thankful for the job they're doing. The Purdue Small Animal Veterinary Hospital in Lafayette, Indiana has just been phenomenal. Great people, caring people. They've done a great job of taking care of Rita and also being there to help Angela because she's still down in Purdue with Rita. So anyway, thanks to everybody. Trevor, great job on your first show, man. Look forward to another one. We'll talk to you all again very soon on the Irish Breakdown Podcast.